There is something particular about the Fallout universe that no other franchise has ever managed to replicate. It is not the monsters. It is not the radiation. It is not even the ruins of a civilization, frozen somewhere between the 1950s and the end of the world. What makes Fallout genuinely unsettling deep down at the level where the unease doesn't quite wash off when you put down the controller is the feeling that the horror was never accidental. That the broken world you're walking through wasn't just destroyed, it was designed. Tonight we're going to go deep into that feeling. We're going to move slowly and carefully through some of the most disturbing theories, pieces of buried lore, and unanswered questions the Fallout series has ever produced. The kind of things that sit in the back of your mind for days after you first encounter them. The kind of details that quietly recontextualize everything you thought you understood about this world. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. Let the ambient crackle of a faraway radio station settle around you. We're going in. Part 1. Vault-Tec and the Architecture of Betrayal. Before a single nuclear warhead ever fell from the sky, before the first mushroom cloud bloomed over an American city, before October 23rd, 2077 became the day the world ended, the people who would survive were already being sorted, already being watched, already being experimented on without their knowledge or consent. This is what most people don't fully process about Vault-Tec. The popular understanding of the company is that it built shelters to protect people from nuclear war, and then, somewhere along the way, things went wrong. That scientists got too excited, that experiments got out of hand, that the people running the program got corrupted by the particular kind of power that comes from having a captive population with nowhere else to go. That understanding is wrong. The experiments were never an accident. The suffering was never an unintended consequence. From the very beginning, from the first architectural drawings and the first government contracts, the vaults were never genuinely meant to save the people inside them. They were designed, in careful detail, with the full knowledge and explicit approval of the United States government, to serve as a vast network of laboratories for studying human behavior under conditions of maximum stress, deprivation, and manufactured fear. Every person who walked through a vault door believing they were being given a chance at survival was, from that first moment forward, a test subject who had never been informed of the study they'd just enrolled in for the rest of their lives. To understand why this was allowed, why a government could sanction the systematic deception and exploitation of its own citizens on this scale, you have to understand who was actually pulling the strings behind Vault-Tec. Its corporate facade, not the salesmen who knocked on suburban doors in the months before the war, not the overseers who were installed to manage the facilities from the inside. The real architects of the Vault program were the Enclave, the shadowy remnant of the pre-war United States government that believed itself to be the only Americans worth preserving. But we'll spend more time with the Enclave later. For now, what matters is that they had a plan stretching decades into the future, and the vaults were a critical infrastructure piece of that plan. Of the 122 vaults that were built before the Great War, only 17 were genuine control vaults, meaning only 17 of them were stocked properly, designed honestly, and intended to actually function as advertised, to provide safe, functional shelter for their residents until the surface became habitable again. The other 105 vaults were something else entirely. Each one had a specific experimental variable introduced deliberately into its design, a specific condition that differed from the norm, built in from the blueprints to see what would happen to human beings under that condition over the course of years or decades or, in some cases, centuries. The scope of what Vault-Tec executed is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind all at once. We're not talking about a few rogue researchers who got carried away. We're talking about a corporation working in sustained partnership with the highest levels of the American government that made a cold calculation about the value of human beings in a post-war world. The calculation went something like this. We know this war is coming. We know civilization is going to collapse. And when it does, whoever rebuilds it is going to need to know everything there is to know about how people behave under total isolation, about what social structures form under extreme duress, about what happens to communities when resources run out, or when leadership becomes corrupt, or when the rules that normally hold civilization together are deliberately removed. The only way to collect that data, real data, not theoretical models or computer simulations, is to run the experiments on actual people. The people in the vaults were not citizens being protected. They were research samples being processed, and the protection they believed they were receiving was the most elaborate deception their government had ever constructed. What's remarkable, when you sit with this for a while, is what it says about the world that existed before the bombs fell. This was not a tyranny hiding in the shadows of a functional democracy. This was a society that had, through the slow accumulation of choices made by people in positions of institutional power, arrived at a place where it was possible for a corporation to sell human beings into captivity by telling them they were being saved, and for the government to sign off on it, and for the new amended Espionage Act to make it illegal to publish any information about Vault-Tec's operations. The people who might have raised questions were silenced not through overt violence but through legislation, through classification, through the same bureaucratic machinery that makes institutional wrongdoing invisible in any large organization. The process was legal. The process was protected. The process was, by the standards of its own time and its own system, normal. The Vault-Tec salesman who appears at your door in the opening moments of Fallout 4, just before the bombs fall, is genuinely cheerful. He believes in the product he's selling. He probably doesn't know, in any detailed way, what the vaults are actually for. He's a man doing his job, promoting a company he may have worked at for years, excited to close a sale. He's not a villain in his own story. He's just a person who never looked hard enough at what he was part of, and that's precisely the most disturbing thing about him. The machine that swallowed an entire civilization wasn't run by people who thought of themselves as monsters. It was run by people who were comfortable enough, or busy enough, or sufficiently insulated from the consequences of their choices to simply not look. Now, of the 122 vaults, let's talk in detail about what the experiments actually were. Because when you move through the specific cases, something shifts. A list of institutional crimes is one thing. The individual stories are something else. Vault 101. In the Capital Wasteland, the vault where the protagonist of Fallout 3 is born and grows up was the one that was never supposed to open. Where most vaults had a theoretical endpoint, a moment when the all-clear signal would arrive and the doors would roll back, Vault 101's plan was different. The doors were never scheduled to open. Not ever. The vault was supplied with exactly the kind of equipment it would need to function indefinitely: spare parts, redundant systems, self-sustaining food, and water production. The experiment here was not about what happened to people under a specific environmental condition. It was about what happened to a community that genuinely believed, through multiple generations, that the outside world was permanently gone, that the door behind them was the edge of the universe. To make this work, Vault-Tec arranged for the vault to receive fabricated radio broadcasts, recordings of a world consumed by catastrophe, scripted and performed before the bombs even fell, played on a loop to reinforce the belief that the surface was uninhabitable. The overseer who maintained this deception, who reinforced it generation after generation and violently suppressed any attempts to leave or to question the narrative, was a Vault-Tec operative placed inside the community specifically for this purpose. Every overseer who followed was chosen with the same goal in mind: keep them inside, keep them afraid, keep them believing there's nowhere else to go. Consider what this means for the children born inside Vault 101. These children had no choice about the world they were born into, obviously, but they also had no access to truth about that world. The belief they inherited that the door behind them was the only boundary between safety and annihilation wasn't something they arrived at through experience or reasoning. It was installed in them through deliberate, sustained deception that passed down through generations like a genetic trait. Their parents believed it because their parents believed it, and so on back to the original residents who walked in voluntarily and were never given a reason to doubt what they'd been told. The lies became their cosmology. The vault became their universe. And outside, through the entire span of their lives, the actual world was slowly and messily rebuilding itself from the wreckage. When the lone wanderer eventually escapes into that world in Fallout 3, it's not framed as a simple adventure. It's framed as a rupture, a shattering of an entire framework that the protagonist has spent their whole life inside. The vaults did different things to different people, but Vault 101 did something particular. It constructed a complete reality, and then protected that construction from outside interference for as long as the vault ran. When it came apart because one person walked through the door, and even that single act of leaving was treated as a catastrophic betrayal by the community that remained. Vault 77 occupies a different place in the lore. Its story has been told through official Fallout media rather than the mainline games, but it belongs in any serious accounting of what the Vault program was. The experiment at Vault 77 was one of the most methodically cruel that Vault-Tec ever designed. One man, alone, with a crate of hand puppets. That's it. One human being, one sealed underground space, and no other company than handcrafted figures with painted eyes. The intended study was isolation in its purest form, not the communal isolation of Vault 101, where people still had each other. Pure, absolute solitude. What the experimenters wanted to know was what happens to the human mind when it is given nothing but itself to work with. How does consciousness organize itself when the feedback loop of social existence, the constant calibration of self against other, is completely removed? What does a person become when there is no one else for them to be anything for? What happened, as the accounts describe it, was that the man inside the vault did what humans do when given nothing. He made something. He invented lives for the puppets. He gave each of them a distinct personality, a history, a way of speaking, a set of beliefs and relationships. He built an entire interior civilization from the raw materials of his own imagination. And then, as the account follows, the civilization he'd built began to turn on him. The factions among the puppets developed their own conflicts, their own political tensions, their own grievances. A coup formed, and the man inside the vault was, in whatever meaningful sense, expelled by the society he had constructed inside his own mind. He emerged into the wasteland having been driven out not by another person or by any external force, but by the population of his own imagination, by what centuries of total isolation had produced when the only raw material was the contents of one human mind. He was, by any ordinary measure, dangerously unstable when he came out. But the thing about this story that doesn't leave you easily is that he wasn't irrational. He wasn't hallucinating in some random way. He was running a perfectly logical system. The logic was just built on a foundation that had nothing outside itself to check against. Vault 92 in the Capital Wasteland was populated specifically with musicians. The experiment ran on a logic that might, in a different context, sound almost reasonable. Vault-Tec wanted to study the effects of white noise stimulus on sleeping human beings over an extended period of time. Musicians were selected because they had trained ears. They would potentially notice auditory anomalies, but also because a community of artists could be expected to handle stress through creative expression and through each other, making the social fabric more observable as it degraded. The white noise was introduced into the sleeping quarters at specific frequencies designed to cause violent outbursts in sleeping subjects. The effects weren't immediate. They never are with this kind of thing. In the early days, the residents noticed only a general restlessness, a diffuse irritability that most of them attributed to the stress of vault life. They adapted, as people do. They created, as artists do. They built community around the one thing they all had in common, which was music, and for a while that community held. Then the symptoms became more specific. The restlessness became paranoia. The irritability became outbursts that people struggled to explain afterward. The close quarters of vault life, which had been a comfort in the early period, became a pressure that the paranoia transformed into something more dangerous. People began attacking each other not randomly, not without what felt in the moment like reason, but with the kind of conviction that characterizes people who are being pushed from the inside by something they can't identify and can't name. The community consumed itself. By the time players explore the vault in Fallout 3, the audio logs inside document a collapse that happened with horrible slowness, not in a single catastrophic event. Over months and years, while people who had been friends and colleagues and collaborators in a shared artistic project became something else entirely. The records from the Overseer suggest she knew what was being pumped through the air supply. They suggest she watched it happen and documented it. That's the detail that lingers. Vault 106, also in the Capital Wasteland, didn't require any such subtle approach. Psychoactive drugs were introduced into the air supply from the beginning. Hallucinogens, paranoia inducers, compounds designed to destabilize the psychological equilibrium of everyone breathing the air inside the vault. The Overseer knew and soothed the residents through the early stages when they noticed something was wrong. reassuring them that these were the normal stresses of adjustment to vault life. By the time the drugs had accumulated to significant levels in the residents' systems, there was no one capable of coherent reassurance anymore. When players explore Vault 106 in Fallout 3, the drugs are still in the air. The ventilation system never stopped. Anyone who spends sufficient time inside begins to feel the effects. The survivors roaming the halls aren't simply hostile in the way that most enemies in the game are hostile. They're the products of a sustained chemical attack on human consciousness. People who were given no way to escape what was being done to them, who have been breathing that air for over 2 centuries. The experiment, in the most awful possible sense, is still running. It has never been turned off, and it never will be. And then Vault 112, which occupies a category of its own. The residents of Vault 112 were placed in virtual reality pods. They were told they would be living out a perfect simulated life in a pleasant environment while the surface recovered from the nuclear exchange. They were not told that the person running the simulation would have complete administrative authority over every element of their experience, could introduce suffering or euphoria or confusion at will, could kill residents in the simulation and resurrect them, could reshape the world they inhabited in any direction he chose, could manipulate every perception and every memory of every person floating in those pods. The overseer of Vault 112 was Dr. Stanislaus Braun, one of the most accomplished scientists of the pre-war era, a man whose career before the war had been defined by genuine brilliance in the field of virtual reality technology. He had been given a system that exceeded anything publicly available, and he had the full administrative access that came with being both the operator and the subject of the simulation. He is also in a pod. He is also in the simulation. He knows the truth. He remembers reality. And what 200 years of absolute power over other people's minds did to him is something the game shows you gradually through the behavior of the characters you encounter in the simulation, through the way certain things don't quite add up, through the revelation of what Braun has been doing with his access and his considerable free time. The residents of Vault 112 are still in those pods when players arrive in Fallout 3. They are still living, or doing whatever it is that constitutes living in a fabricated reality. They've been there for over 2 centuries. They don't know. They believe they are in a pleasant American suburb in the 1950s. They believe, in whatever way is possible for people whose beliefs are being generated by a machine, that this is their life. And Braun has been reshaping that life at his discretion for all of that time, with no oversight, no accountability, and nothing to do with his power except use it. When you think about the scale of the Vault program as a whole, what you're confronted with is not just a list of cruelties. You're confronted with a philosophy that said, we have the right to determine what happens to these people, because we are the ones building the future, and they are the material we're building it from. That philosophy isn't a historical aberration. It's a tendency, something that reassembles itself whenever power becomes sufficiently concentrated and sufficiently insulated from the people it's concentrated over. The Vault program wasn't a departure from what America was. It was, in a particular and deeply uncomfortable sense, a culmination of it. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're new here and this is exactly the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe. We're only just beginning. Part 2. The individual horrors experiments that deserve their own space. The broad architecture of the Vault program is disturbing enough on its own, but there are individual experiments that deserve more sustained attention because each of them illuminates a different dimension of what Vault-Tec was willing to do, and what different conditions do to different kinds of people over extended periods of time. Vault 75 is one that players can find beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4. The school's name, a middle school, a place associated with children, is the first signal of what the building is sitting above. Beneath it, for generations, Vault-Tec ran one of its most targeted and systematically cruel programs. The Vault recruited children specifically, not children who happened to come in with their families, but children who were identified and selected for their physical and cognitive potential, brought in alongside adults who were managed separately and kept comfortable enough not to alarm, kept separate enough from the Vault's actual operations that they couldn't intervene in what was happening to their children. The children were subjected to combat training, nutritional regimens designed to optimize physical development, and continuous psychological evaluation. They grew up inside a system that was assessing them constantly, measuring them against criteria they were never told about. When they reached 18, they were evaluated against the Vault's standards. If they passed, they were removed. Where to? The Vault's records don't fully clarify, though the implication is that they became assets for some larger program. If they didn't pass the evaluation, they were killed. This is where the Vault program's logic arrives at something that's difficult to categorize as anything except straightforwardly genocidal in its methodology. The children raised inside Vault 75 weren't subjects of a psychological study. They were being cultivated, like plants in a controlled environment, for a specific yield. The ones that produced the yield were harvested. The ones that didn't were discarded. The records inside the Vault include communications from the personnel who managed this process, and what those records reveal is a range of responses. Some personnel were clinical and methodical, their language stripped of emotional content, documenting the Vault's operations with the neutrality of people who have fully internalized the institution's framing. Others show the effort required to maintain that neutrality, and a small number seem to suggest someone who knew, on some level, that they were doing something they couldn't look at directly and had found a way to keep doing it anyway. Vault 81, in the same region, offers a study in what happens when one person inside the machine decides not to cooperate. This vault was designed to test cures for every disease known to humanity by using the resident population as unwitting test subjects, drugs, antivirals, experimental compounds all introduced through the vault's water and air supply, with the residents never informed that they were being treated, infected, and observed simultaneously. The assigned researcher, a scientist placed inside the vault specifically to run the program, prepared the systems and then stopped. He couldn't do it. The people around him, the children playing, the adults building their lives, the ordinary human activity of a community trying to survive were more real to him than the research mandate. He sabotaged the program. He falsified the data. He sent Vault-Tec dummy results and let the community around him live without the experiment running. Vault 81 survived. It's functional and inhabited when players find it in Fallout 4. One prototype disease did escape into the Vault's sublevels, a mole rat infection that causes a specific and treatable condition, and there's a child with that condition whom players can try to help. But the population is alive. One person's crisis of conscience, one moment of seeing clearly and choosing differently, changed the outcome for an entire community. The tragedy is that this kind of clarity required someone to already be inside the machine before they could turn against its direction. Vault 11 sits in a different category. It's in the Mojave of Fallout New Vegas, and what happened inside it is a study in the specific horror that emerges when a community is given a framework that makes its own destruction feel logical. The setup was this. The Vault's residents were told, from the beginning, that unless they sacrificed one person from their community each year, the Vault's systems would destroy everyone inside. They were not told this was a lie. They were told the sacrifice was necessary, that Vault-Tec required it, that the alternative was collective annihilation. For 75 years, Vault 11 held annual elections. The community selected a member to sacrifice. The political maneuvering, the social manipulation, the alliances formed and broken in service of ensuring someone else's name was on the ballot rather than your own. All of this is documented in the terminal records inside the vault. People who were neighbors and friends and colleagues built elaborate systems for deciding who would die next. They created political institutions around the question. They developed informal rules about who could be nominated and who couldn't, about what kinds of social debts could be used to protect you, and what kinds of vulnerability made you more likely to be chosen. The community spent decades building a civilization around the annual question of who would be killed. Eventually, 5 residents refused. They stood together and said they would not participate in the sacrifice system. The terminal records suggest they expected to die. What happened instead was that the message the vault systems had been configured to deliver the supposed consequence for refusing was a congratulatory recording. Vault-Tec commended them for their commitment to human life. The vault doors were supposed to open, but the 5 survivors were the only ones left. The 75 years of sacrifice and political violence had reduced the community to a handful. Whatever Vault-Tec had meant to learn from the experiment had been learned at the cost of almost everyone inside. The 5 people who remained in Vault 11, who had finally done the thing that ended the experiment, had to walk out into a world full of evidence of what their community had been willing to do to survive. Vault 22, in the Mojave, tried something different: agriculture. The experiment was to use the vault as a contained environment for developing plant-based food sources that could sustain a post-war population. The researchers inside made genuine scientific progress. They also, in the process of their experiments, developed something they didn't fully understand: a fungal pathogen, spread through spores, that infected human hosts and eventually took control of their motor functions. The infected residents could walk, could move, could interact with the environment, but they weren't driving anymore. By the time players explore Vault 22, the plants have spread through everything. The spores are in the air. The infected are still there, still moving, still performing the mechanical motions of human activity, but the humans themselves, the actual people who went into that vault, are gone in any meaningful sense. What happened at Vault 22 is a different kind of horror, from Vault 92's deliberate poisoning or Vault 11's managed sacrifice system. It's the horror of unintended consequences inside a container that can't process them. The research wasn't malicious. The people doing it were probably doing their best. The outcome was the effective end of every human inside the vault, achieved not through deliberate design, but through the ordinary risks of scientific work conducted in a closed system where there was nowhere for mistakes to go except inward. The vault was supposed to be a solution. It became, through the logic of the experiment itself, the mechanism of destruction. Vault 34, also in the Mojave, tried something even more direct. It overstocked its population with weapons and ammunition, gave the residents nearly unlimited access to firearms in a closed environment, and waited to see how a heavily armed community organized itself. What it produced was a community chronically on the edge of violence, where the presence of so much lethal capacity made every conflict more dangerous and every resolution more fragile. The vault's reactor was eventually damaged in an incident involving the armed population. The exact circumstances aren't certain, and the resulting radiation exposure killed or mutated most of the vault's residents. The irradiated survivors can still be found there when players explore it. Each of these experiments is a different answer to the same dark question: what breaks first? What part of human civilization is the most fragile, the most dependent on conditions that can be deliberately removed? The Vault program's disturbing conclusion, drawn across over 100 experimental populations, is that almost everything breaks. What it takes varies. How long it takes varies. But the endpoint communities turning on themselves, consuming their own, losing the framework that made them possible, arrives in almost every vault. The 17 control vaults that were genuinely stocked and operated fairly survived in higher proportions. The other 105 are, in most cases, ruins. The experiment produced its data. The data says that human community, under sufficient pressure, is not stable. Whether anything useful can be done with that data, whether it actually helps anyone rebuild anything worth having, is a question the Fallout series asks without answering. Part 3. The Dunwich Horror: What Lived Before the Bombs. There is a location in the southwest corner of the Capital Wasteland that most players approach once and don't return to. It's called the Dunwich Building. No major quests require you to go there. The rewards for exploring it aren't exceptional. It's full of feral ghouls and a residue of something that doesn't feel like the ordinary dread of a ruined place. Most of the ruins in Fallout 3 feel haunted by history, by the absence of the people who used to occupy them, by the material traces of lives the war cut short. The Dunwich Building feels haunted by something that was there before the people arrived, and that is still there now. The building was owned by a corporation called Dunwich Borers LLC. The company's stated business was manufacturing deep-bore drilling technology, acoustic boring devices used for tunneling, for quarrying, for reaching materials that conventional equipment couldn't access. The name, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, should register immediately. The Dunwich Horror is one of Lovecraft's most celebrated stories, set in a fictional town in Massachusetts where an ancient entity of cosmic scale makes contact with the human world and begins, gradually, to unmake the people caught in its proximity. Bethesda used that name deliberately. The entire Dunwich location in Fallout is a sustained Lovecraftian reference, and understanding it requires taking that reference seriously rather than treating it as a surface-level Easter egg. When a player enters the Dunwich building, they find a series of audio logs left by a man named Jaime. The first log is recorded in the voice of someone cautious but functional, a scavenger exploring an abandoned ruin looking for something, alert to the standard dangers of the capital wasteland but otherwise in command of himself. As the logs progress, Jaime's voice changes. Not all at once, gradually, in ways that are easy to miss individually but accumulate into something that is very hard to ignore. The language becomes less linear. References appear to things Jamie doesn't explain, places he seems to have visited in his mind, if not physically, that don't map onto the building he's exploring. There are fragments that sound like prayer or like ritual language, appearing in a context where neither would be expected. Names begin to surface. Abdul Alhazred, the fictional author of the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mythology, and another, Gay. These are not random choices. In Lovecraft's framework, these syllables are fragments of a pre-human language, sounds associated with entities that existed before human civilization and that operate on scales of time and space that make human history feel like a momentary flicker. The fact that Jaime begins repeating them without being able to explain where he heard them, without any apparent source for the knowledge, implies that something in the building transferred them to him, that some mechanism of contact has been made, and that the language Jaime is now producing is not his own. The building is structured in 3 descending sections, each one darker than the last, each one further from the surface world. The deepest section, labeled the Virulent Underchambers, is where the architecture changes character entirely. The player stops moving through what feels like an abandoned office building, stained carpet, collapsed ceiling tiles, the familiar decay of a pre-war commercial space, and starts moving through something different. The stone walls, visible through gaps in the building's original structure, are older than the building, much older. Carved, shaped, worked by something that had reasons for being down there that predate the Dunwich Borers Corporation by an amount of time the game never specifies. At the center of the deepest chamber is an obelisk. The obelisk is wrapped in tendrils, organic or quasi-organic structures growing around and through it. On its surface, embedded in the stone rather than carved onto it, there is a humanoid shape pressing outward, not a decoration, not a representation. Something inside the stone, reaching toward the outside, in a posture that implies it has been doing this for a very long time and has not yet succeeded but has not given up. And a voice whispers in that space, whispers Alhazred, whispers Gieth, a voice that has no identifiable source and that matches the sounds Jaime was making in his final audio log, which is otherwise almost entirely incoherent. The in-universe history of Dunwich Borers LLC, assembled from fragments scattered across multiple games and supplementary materials, provides a framework for what all of this might mean. The company was founded by a man named Richard Dunwich, and the official account describes him and his partner, his brother Constance Blackhall, as having an unusual and long-standing obsession with occult subjects. This is not necessarily remarkable on its own. There have always been wealthy people with eccentric interests. What makes the Dunwich case significant is the specific intersection between that occult interest and the company's stated industrial purpose. Deep-bore drilling, by definition, is about reaching things that are not accessible through ordinary means. Things beneath the surface, things buried, things that have been down there for a very long time. Dunwich Borers was extraordinarily successful with their acoustic bore technology in a market dominated by conventional equipment, successful enough to attract major government contracts, successful enough to remain financially powerful even as safety violations and workplace deaths accumulated to a degree that, in a functioning regulatory environment, should have ended the company's operations years before the war. The lore suggests, in language careful enough to maintain plausible deniability, that the deaths at Dunwich facilities might not have been the result of negligence, that the company's leadership might have viewed them differently, as contributions to something. The Point Lookout DLC in Fallout 3 extends the Dunwich thread significantly. A quest there sends the player to find an object called the Krivbekni, a book connected to an entity called Ug Qualtoth, whose name follows the phonetic patterns of Lovecraft's invented mythology closely enough that the parallel is clearly intentional. The Blackhall family of Point Lookout, the family whose estate the player explores, whose history of occult practice and cult activity is the subject of the DLC's most disturbing revelations, turns out to be connected to Richard Dunwich by family lineage. The Blackhalls and the Dunwiches are the same bloodline, pursuing the same interest across generations, in different institutional forms. The drilling company was one manifestation. The cult in Point Lookout was another. The object at the center of the cult's practices connects to the same entity that the whispers in the Dunwich building's deepest chamber seem to reference. Fallout 4 returns to the Dunwich lineage in the Commonwealth, at a quarry in the eastern part of the map called Dunwich Borers. Players can be sent there by the railroad on a fairly routine mission and find anything but routine. The quarry is visually unremarkable at the surface level. As the player descends through its levels, something starts to happen. Flashbacks begin, sudden, unexplained moments where the screen goes briefly white and the player sees fragments of what the quarry looked like before the war, and what they see in those fragments is not industrial activity. The postures and arrangements of the people visible suggest ceremony rather than labor. The configurations suggest ritual. The flickering glimpses feel more like intrusion than memory, like something is showing the player these images rather than the images simply existing as environmental data. At the deepest level of the quarry, past the raiders whose terminal entries document a progressive mental deterioration that began when they moved into the site and accelerated with no apparent cause, past the feral ghouls who seem to have gathered there in numbers that suggest something drawing them rather than simply habitat, there is a submerged chamber. Cold, dark water fills it. And at the center, on a stone altar of carved rock that is clearly not a product of any post-war or even modern pre-war construction, there is a weapon called Kremvh's Tooth. Kremv's Tooth is described by the game as a ritual blade. It's not framed as a weapon someone made for practical purposes and lost. It's framed as an object that was made to be on that altar, that belongs in that space, that has been there and in use in a context the player is only seeing the aftermath of. The altar around it is carved with symbols. Stone pillars surround it, and beneath the water, visible if the player looks carefully, is the outline of a massive carved stone face staring upward from the darkness of the pool. The face is not small, it is enormous. It is the face of something that was carved into the stone at a depth and with a scale that required purpose and resources that have nothing to do with the mining company operating above it. The theory that emerges from all of this, not a theory exactly, more an implication the game is building carefully across multiple entries, is that Dunwich Borers LLC was an instrument. The drilling business was real and profitable, but the company's actual purpose was excavation in service of something much older. Richard Dunwich and his descendants used the company's legitimate industrial operations as cover for reaching depth, for getting to the place where something had been sealed, or sleeping, or waiting, for longer than human history records. The safety violations, the workplace deaths, these, the darker interpretation suggests, were not accidents or negligence but maintenance, a modern form of the human sacrifices that had once been performed at the surface-level sites of the company's ancient predecessors. Whatever Ugg Qualtoth actually is, required something from the human beings who sought access to it. And the company, generation after generation, provided. The Fallout series never confirms this reading in explicit terms. It holds the line carefully between suggestion and direct statement, and that restraint is exactly right artistically, because a confirmed monster is a problem that can potentially be addressed with a shotgun and sufficient ammunition. An ancient entity of uncertain nature and unclear power, connected to a pre-war corporate lineage that may have been feeding it with its own employees and is now scattered across the ruins of the world it helped end, is something different. It's something that exists just beyond the boundary of what can be resolved through normal means. What the Dunwich thread asks, across all its iterations and all its games, is a question that the rest of Fallout doesn't often raise. What if the nuclear war wasn't the original catastrophe? What if the radiation and the violence and the collapse were all downstream of something that was already wrong, something humanity had been orbiting for its entire history, periodically contacted by the individuals most willing to go to extreme lengths to reach it? What if the wasteland isn't just the aftermath of human ambition outrunning human wisdom? What if it's also an environment in which something older becomes easier to reach, now that so much of the infrastructure that once insulated the surface from the depths has been stripped away? That question doesn't have an answer. The Dunwich locations were designed to not answer it, and that's exactly why they stay with you. Part 4. What makes a ghoul feral? The question nobody can fully answer. They roam the dark corridors of collapsed buildings and flood-damaged hospitals. They move through the ruins of supermarkets and schools and office parks, their bodies carrying the ghost of routines they no longer consciously follow. When you find them, you fight them, because they will attack you without hesitation or recognition. But the games keep telling you in holotapes and terminal entries and the occasional passing comment from a character who knew someone who ghoulified that these were people once. The shambling thing in the basement of a pre-war grocery store was a person who bought food there. The creature roaming the hospital wing was a patient, or a nurse, or a doctor who tried to help other people. What makes a ghoul go feral is one of the questions the Fallout series has been carefully, not fully answering for its entire run. The games offer fragments, theories from characters who are themselves uncertain, medical documentation that stops short of definitive conclusions, and the incompleteness of the explanation doesn't feel like an oversight. It feels deliberate, in the way that the most disturbing gaps in knowledge feel deliberate not because anyone is hiding the answer, but because the answer is genuinely difficult to see, and what you can see of it is already disturbing enough. Ghouls are human beings whose bodies have been irradiated to a degree that should have killed them but didn't. The radiation caused a fundamental cellular restructuring, a wholesale transformation of their physiology that deformed their bodies, made them resistant to further radiation, extended their lifespans dramatically, rendered them infertile, and changed the relationship between their cells and the environmental conditions that would kill an ordinary human being. A ghoul who maintains their cognitive function can live essentially indefinitely. Some of the ghouls players encounter across the games have been alive since before the Great War, over 200 years, walking through the ruins of the world that used to exist. But some ghouls go feral. Their higher brain functions deteriorate until what remains is something that operates on raw instinct. Feral ghouls attack anything that isn't also a feral ghoul. They cannot be negotiated with. They cannot remember the people they were. They are, for any practical purpose, no longer the people they used to be. The medical literature available in the games describes the process with a specific term: ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy. The language is precise enough to suggest that someone studied this process and tried to codify it. The precision ends there. What actually happens in the brain of a ghoul as it transitions toward ferality, what the mechanism is, whether it's purely physiological or whether environmental and psychological factors contribute, whether there's a reliable way to predict who will go feral and who won't, none of this is definitively resolved anywhere in the games. What we can piece together suggests that the process is neurological and that it isn't uniform. Not all ghouls go feral on the same timeline, and there is significant evidence that some ghouls never go feral at all. The variables that seem to matter include cumulative radiation exposure, social connectivity, and psychological factors that aren't well understood even within the world of the games. The social connectivity piece is particularly worth dwelling on. There's consistent implication across multiple Fallout games that ghouls who remain socially embedded, who maintain relationships, who continue to engage with the world and with other people, who have reasons to participate in their environment tend to maintain their cognitive function longer than ghouls who become isolated. This maps, unsettlingly, onto what we understand about cognitive decline in human beings. The people who maintain social connections and continue to participate in the lives around them tend to maintain their mental acuity longer than those who withdraw into isolation. The biological mechanism in ghouls is presumably different, but the correlation is there. The implication, if you follow it, is that the feral ghouls roaming the wasteland are not simply the inevitable outcome of ghoulification. They're, at least in some cases, the outcome of ghoulification plus something that happened afterward: isolation, loss, the collapse of the social world that might have sustained them. Characters in the games reference this indirectly. There's dialogue suggesting that ghouls, who find communities, who are accepted somewhere and have a place, tend to do better over time than ghouls who are driven out by human prejudice that treats all ghouls as pre-feral. The cruelest dimension of this is what it suggests about that prejudice itself. The humans who fear ghouls, who exclude them from their communities on the assumption that ghoulification inevitably leads to ferality. Those humans, through the mechanism of exclusion, may be actively accelerating the outcome they fear. The ghoul driven out of town because of how they look, forced into isolation in a ruin somewhere, losing their connections to other minds. There are reasons for engagement that ghouls' trajectory toward ferality is being shaped by the community's refusal to include them. The fear creates its own evidence. This is not a story Fallout tells explicitly. It's a story you assemble from the pieces. But the pieces are all there, and the assembled picture is one of the quieter horrors in the franchise. The most intimate and disturbing single piece of evidence about the feralization process is contained in the audio logs of the Dunwich Building. Players who find all of Jaime's tapes can listen to a man's voice change across the full arc of the recordings. The first log sounds like a person. By the middle logs, something has shifted, not the content exactly, but the quality of the voice behind it. The precision of expression softens. Sentences that should connect begin to drift. Words appear that feel borrowed from somewhere rather than generated by intent. By the final log, Jaime is a feral ghoul. The transformation is complete, but the sequence in between the logs where the transformation is in progress is what makes the Dunwich Building particularly affecting. You can hear someone losing access to themselves. Not in a dramatic way, not with suffering that's performed for the listener's benefit, but in the way that cognitive decline actually happens, gradually, with moments where the previous person seems to reassert themselves before being pulled back again, with the particular quality of confusion that comes from inside rather than from outside. Jaime doesn't know what's happening to him in the middle logs, or he knows something is happening but can't name it. The thing that would need to remain intact to understand the process is exactly the thing that's going. The Fallout TV series added something genuinely important to this picture. The character known as the Ghoul Cooper Howard, a pre-war actor who has been surviving the wasteland for over 200 years, carries vials of a specific medication and must take them regularly to maintain his cognitive function. When he runs out, or when circumstances prevent him from accessing the medication, he begins to lose himself. The series shows this happening in real time in its second season, with extraordinary care. First, his voice changes in ways he doesn't control, involuntary sounds escaping him. Then muscle control begins to fail, his hands curling into shapes that don't respond to conscious direction. His thoughts become harder to organize and express. He's aware of what's happening, for a while. He can observe the process occurring, and then the observation itself becomes part of what's being taken. If this addition to the lore is taken seriously, it changes how you look at every feral ghoul in every Fallout game. Because if ferality can be slowed or prevented with treatment, then the feral ghouls roaming the basement of that hospital or clustering in that collapsed apartment building are not inevitable. They are people who were cut off from treatment by the collapse of whatever systems might have supplied it, by the violence of the wasteland making safe passage to any supply impossible, by the simple, brutal fact that, in a world where almost everything has been destroyed, pharmaceutical continuity is not something most survivors can maintain. The enemy you fight in every vault and every ruin was, with access to the right resources, preventable. One more detail about feral ghouls that players almost never register consciously: the places they cluster. Feral ghouls, across all the games, tend to congregate in places that were familiar to them before they lost themselves. Supermarkets, schools, hospitals, office buildings, medical facilities. The patterns of their movement, when you observe them carefully, carry traces of the purposes those places once served: the pacing of someone who used to work a register, the clustering around spaces that were once waiting rooms, the physical memory of routines that no longer have a mind behind them to remember why they matter. Their bodies remember. Whatever ferality erases memory, language, recognition, the capacity for complex thought, it doesn't erase the deep physical encoding of place. And occasionally, if you take the time to look at the objects found on feral ghoul corpses, you find things. Pre-war photographs, lockets, keycards for buildings that don't exist anymore, small personal items that no longer mean anything to the creature carrying them, but that meant something once, to the person who put them in their pocket. Those people are still in there, in some residual, unreachable sense, not in any way that can be communicated with, but in the way that a place retains the shape of what it was even after everything inside it has been removed. Part 5. The synth question consciousness, slavery, and the Institute. Beneath the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, behind a railroad and an elevator and security measures that only reveal themselves once you've navigated past them, there is an organization that has been operating in secret for generations. It has no above-ground presence. No visible settlements, no territory markers, no flags. The people who know it exists don't speak of it freely, and the people who don't know it exists sometimes disappear and are replaced seamlessly, sometimes undetectably by things that look, sound, and behave exactly like the people who vanished. The Institute creates synthetic people, not robots in any ordinary sense. Generation 3 synths, the most advanced products of decades of Institute research, are biologically and physiologically identical to natural humans in every measurable way. They have organic tissue, working anatomy, blood with the right composition. They breathe. They eat. They can be injured in the ways humans can be injured. They have memories, which they experience as their own. Some of them have full histories, families, relationships that extend back years. Some of them don't know they're synths. They believe completely that they are the people whose memories they carry. The Institute's position, articulated most clearly by Father Sean, who is, in one of the game's most deliberately disorienting revelations, the biological son of the player character, born in Vault 111, and now an elderly man who has spent his life working within the Institute, is that this doesn't fundamentally matter. Synths, regardless of how sophisticated their presentation, are not conscious. They are advanced machines. Very convincing in their simulation of human experience, certainly, but simulating something is not the same as having it. The Institute built a better tool, and feeling sentimental about the tool's performance is a mistake about categories. The problem with this position is that the claim is unfalsifiable in the direction Sean needs it to be. You cannot prove from the outside that another being is conscious. You can observe behavior that is consistent with consciousness. You can note that the being in question acts in every observable way, like something that is having experiences. But the actual presence or absence of inner experience, the question of whether there is something it is like to be this thing, is not something that external observation can definitively settle. Dr. Alan Binet, who works inside the Institute, has been attempting to gather evidence relevant to this question. His specific claim is that Institute synths dream. He has collected data suggesting that during synth dormancy periods, there is brainwave activity that corresponds to the neurological patterns associated with dreaming in biological organisms. He goes further in private conversations and in his personal notes. He posits that if synths dream, they may have something that functions like a soul, not in a theological sense necessarily, but in the sense of an inner life that persists across different states of consciousness. That constitutes a continuing self. Binet knows the risks of saying this inside the Institute. He knows the institutional position. He continues to research anyway, which is itself suggestive, either genuine scientific integrity or a specific moral courage that doesn't map cleanly onto the organization he works within. The Synth Retention Bureau is the Institute's answer to synth escape attempts. When a synth physically breaks free and attempts to live on the surface, the Bureau hunts them down. They are retrieved. Their memories are wiped through a process the game never describes in detail, though the fact that this detail is withheld may itself be a choice. After the memory wipe, the synth may not remember their escape, or the life they attempted to build on the surface, or the people they formed connections with during that time. The synth who understood themselves as one person goes through the procedure and wakes up as someone different, not with a different body, not visibly changed, but without access to the continuity that constituted who they were becoming. The Railroad, the faction that operates as the Institute's primary opposition, treats this as slavery. Their argument is direct. The synths are beings who act in every observable way like people who are experiencing their lives, who form attachments and make choices and try to survive, who have enough of whatever constitutes personhood that taking away their freedom and their memories qualifies as a crime. The Railroad provides escaped synths with new memories and new identities, a process they call retirement, with specific irony. In this context, it means you get to become someone new, someone the Institute isn't looking for. Nick Valentine complicates the theoretical question in the most direct and unavoidable way the game could have designed. Nick is a synth. He's been living on the surface for years by the time the player finds him, locked in a trash compactor. He's a detective. He has a case file he was working on when he got locked up, and when the player frees him, his first question is about the case. He has commitments that extend across time. He has professional pride and personal loyalty, and a specific ironic sensibility about the world that is entirely his own. If Nick Valentine is not conscious, the question is what the sense that matters means when we talk about consciousness. What distinguishes the experience that counts from the experience that doesn't? If the answer involves origin, if the requirement is that consciousness must arise from biological rather than synthetic processes, then the argument has to grapple with the fact that biological consciousness is itself a physical process, a pattern of electrochemical activity in organic tissue that produces experience as an emergent property. The question of why one kind of physical process generates real experience and another kind generates only the appearance of it is not a question with a clean answer. Fallout 4 doesn't try to give the question a clean answer. What it does instead is use its characters to make the question feel consequential, to ensure that players who are paying attention experience the stakes not as abstract philosophy, but as something with a face and a name and a history. Paladin Danse is the case the game makes most directly. For a significant portion of the Brotherhood of Steel questline, Danse is a companion, one of the most committed, most principled members of the Brotherhood, a soldier who has built his entire identity around the organization and its mission. If the player pursues the questline far enough, they discover that Danse is a synth who had no knowledge of his own nature. His memories of his life, his career, his relationship with the Brotherhood, everything he understood as himself, was either fabricated or occurred during a period when he was operating without access to the truth about what he was. The revelation unmakes him in a specific and precise way. Not because he becomes different in any observable sense. His personality, his values, his responses to things around him don't change. But because the foundation on which his sense of himself was built has collapsed, the continuity that connected who he remembered being to who he understood himself to be now has been revealed as something installed rather than lived. And Danse doesn't know what to do with that. He doesn't know which of his responses are his and which are programmed. He doesn't know if the distinction matters. He doesn't know, in the most basic possible sense, who he is. This is where Fallout 4 does something the game is occasionally underrated for. It takes the philosophical question of identity and grounds it in an emotional experience that players can recognize. Anyone who has had a belief about themselves fundamentally challenged, anyone who has discovered that something they understood about their history was wrong, will recognize the specific quality of disorientation Danse experiences. The synth question is a specific science-fictional version of a more general question about how identity holds together and what happens when the threads get pulled. Part 6. The Enclave. America's Shadow Still Walking. Let's talk about the organization that was behind all of it, not just behind the Vault program. Behind the Great War itself, if the evidence scattered across the games and the TV series is read in its full accumulation, the Enclave is presented in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 as the primary villain, well-armed remnants of the pre-war US government in power armor, pursuing a genocidal eugenics program in the ruins of the world. On the surface, that's a straightforward villain premise. Ideologically extreme faction with military capability needs stopping. But when you trace the Enclave backward through its history, from its post-war activities through its pre-war foundations, you reach somewhere more structurally disturbing than a simple antagonist. You reach the conclusion that the Enclave was not something that emerged from the apocalypse. It was something that produced the apocalypse, with knowledge, with preparation, possibly with active participation. The Enclave began as what its members would have called a shadow government, a network of individuals who occupied positions of legitimate public-facing power, senators, generals, senior scientists, corporate executives, intelligence operatives who also participated in a parallel structure of authority that operated outside any formal accountability framework. They thought of themselves as the continuation of America, the essential core that would preserve what mattered when the outer layers burned away. What they actually were was the segment of American power that had decided the rest of America was expendable in service of the long-term goals that they, and they alone, had the capacity to pursue. They had been watching the resource wars. They had run the projections. They had calculated, with the confidence that comes from access to classified intelligence from multiple agencies simultaneously, that a nuclear exchange between the United States and China was not a possibility to be prevented, but an eventuality to be managed. And so they began managing it not toward prevention, but toward survival on their terms and extraction of maximum value from the collapse they believed was coming regardless. Their connections to the Vault-Tec program have already been described. The Enclave had a hand in Project Safehouse, the government initiative that funded the vault construction, and they shaped the experimental nature of the program because they needed data that the experimental conditions would generate. The vault residents were their laboratory. The vaults were their infrastructure for the world they intended to build in the aftermath. The post-war enclave that players meet in Fallout 2 has been waiting on an offshore oil rig since the Great War, maintaining pre-war technology and infrastructure, developing their ideology to its endpoint, and observing the surface world while telling themselves that the observation was preparation for their eventual return as the inheritors of civilization. By 2241, when the Chosen One encounters them, the plan has settled into what the Enclave calls human purification, the elimination through FEV modification of every human being whose genetic history includes radiation exposure. This means every person who survived the war on the surface or whose ancestors did. The plan is, in the most literal sense, genocide. The elimination of the entire post-war human population to make room for the Enclave's lineage. The people who designed this plan did not experience themselves as monsters. They had built an ideology over decades that genuinely supported their conclusions. The logic from inside it made sense. The wasteland population was too damaged by radiation to constitute genuine humanity as they defined it. The only way to rebuild real civilization was to start from a population that hadn't been contaminated. The fact that this required the murder of everyone currently alive outside their rig was a practical necessity. Regrettable but unavoidable, the cost of doing what had to be done. What the Fallout TV series added to this framework across its first 2 seasons was the dimension of causation. The show places representatives of the Enclave at the table where the nuclear war was decided, not waiting for it, participating in its design. The figure described as the true villain of the series, the unknown presence that held Vault-Tec's corporate leadership accountable to a plan they may not have fully understood, and they were part of that figure, is connected to the Enclave. The implication being that the Great War wasn't the result of geopolitical escalation and miscalculation. It was the result of a decision. Specific people in specific positions who decided that the world needed to end so that the right world could begin. If that reading is accurate, then everything that follows the vaults, the wasteland, the suffering that has defined 2 centuries of survivors' lives, every ghoul and every super mutant and every dying settlement and every child born into a world designed to be hostile to their survival is downstream of a choice made by a small group of people who believed they had the right to determine what the future would be and who were wrong in the most consequential possible way. The Enclave in Fallout 3 has a different plan in a different region, but the same underlying logic. Project Purity, the water purification initiative, becomes a target for contamination with a modified FEV toxin that would kill anyone with radiation in their genetic background. Colonel Autumn, the military commander, wants to control it rather than contaminate it, to position the Enclave as the providers of clean water and thereby rebuild their political legitimacy. This internal disagreement represents, in miniature, the tension within any institutional expression of extreme ideology. The argument between those who want to pursue the ultimate goal directly and those who want to build a path toward it through incremental means. Neither position abandons the core conviction. They're arguing about method and timeline, not about whether the underlying premise is correct. What makes the Enclave worth extended attention as a faction isn't the power armor or the vertibirds. It's that the psychology underneath them is not alien. The conviction that some people are more fully human than others, that the right group's survival justifies the wrong group's suffering, that legitimate grievance about catastrophe excuses violence against people who had no role in causing it. These are not exotic beliefs. They're variants of beliefs that appear in human history with disturbing regularity, in different contexts and different costumes, each time convincing the people holding them that this instance is different, that this time the logic is sound. The Enclave is recognizable. That's the most disturbing thing about them. Part 7. The mysterious stranger, a figure without a bottom. He appears in your peripheral vision. He's there when you've run out of options, when the enemies ahead of you are too many and your ammunition is almost gone. He fires once, twice, and then he's gone. Before you can turn around, before you can address him, before you can ask who he is or why he keeps showing up, he wears a trench coat and a fedora and carries a .44 Magnum, and he has been appearing in the Fallout series since the very first game in 1997. Most players laugh about the mysterious stranger. He's a perk mechanic, a clever bit of game design, a recurring bit of humor that rewards you for having good luck. For most players, that's the level the joke operates on, and it's a good joke at that level. But across the series, the stranger has accumulated a body of lore that makes the joke less simple the longer you look at it. The timeline is the first thing to reckon with. The mysterious stranger has been documented appearing across multiple games representing decades of in-universe time and the full width of the former United States. In Fallout 76, set in Appalachia in the early post-war years, he's there. In the original Fallout and Fallout 2, set in California decades later, he's there. In Fallout 3, set in the Capital Wasteland in 2277, he's there. In Fallout New Vegas in 2281, he's there. In Fallout 4, set in the Commonwealth in 2287, he's there. This is a confirmed active period of over 2 centuries, spanning the continent from east to west, and no one ages. No one changes. The figure in the trench coat with the fedora is exactly the same at every appearance across all of those years and all of those locations. Nick Valentine, who is himself a synth detective with a particular interest in unsolved cases and a methodical approach to information, has a case file on the mysterious stranger in his office. It doesn't provide answers, it provides confirmed sightings, geographic range, estimated frequency of appearances, and a conclusion that Valentine has to articulate with unusual care. He doesn't know who this is. He doesn't know what this is. He doesn't know why this is. The case is open and likely to remain so. The in-universe literary reference embedded in the character's name is worth pursuing. The Mysterious Stranger is the title of an unfinished Mark Twain novel. In Twain's text, the title character appears to ordinary people in moments of human crisis and gradually reveals himself to be a supernatural entity, a being who exists outside the normal framework of human experience, connected to themes of determinism, free will, the question of whether the choices people make have genuine meaning, or whether the shape of things is already fixed. The Fallout Mysterious Stranger carries that literary ancestry into the post-nuclear context. He's not just a helpful wanderer with good timing. He's an allusion to something that doesn't entirely fit the rational, science-fictional framework that governs most of the series' world-building. The Lonesome Drifter in New Vegas is a character the game uses to drop an implication about the stranger's personal history. A solitary singer camped in the desert, playing music for an audience of nobody, with a unique revolver called the Mysterious Magnum, a gun that, when drawn, plays the same distinctive guitar notes that accompany the stranger's appearance in combat. The Drifter speaks of his father as a mysterious man, a stranger to his own family. The connection the game is drawing is clear without being stated. The mysterious stranger is, or at some point was, the Drifter's father, which means he was once human enough to father a child, to have a family. To leave a child behind with only a weapon and the knowledge of absence. If the stranger was once human enough to father a child, then the question of what he has become over 200 years of appearing at exactly the right moment across the entire continent, without aging, without explanation, without any visible mechanism for how any of this is possible, is a different kind of question. Not what is this creature, but what did this person become, and when, and how? The mysterious savior in New Vegas appears to players who get close to death and heals them rather than killing enemies. Same clothing. Misfortune, the comedic alternative perk, produces a veiled woman who fumbles her interventions in ways that are funny rather than effective. Whether these represent a family of the same type of entity, or a tradition of beings who occupy this particular role, or something else entirely, the games don't say. What the mysterious stranger represents at the level of story is something Fallout rarely makes explicit but consistently implies, that the wasteland has its own kind of grace. Not divine grace, Not the grace of a good world or a merciful universe, but something more conditional, something that shows up in moments of extremity, that operates outside the normal framework of cause and effect, that cannot be summoned or dismissed, but that has been there, at the worst moments, for over 200 years. Whether this is reassuring or disturbing depends entirely on what you think it means that such a thing is needed and has been needed for this long. Part 8. Mr. House, the God Who Never Slept. Robert Edwin House was born on the 25th of June, 2020. He founded Robco Industries at 22 years old, making him one of the youngest billionaires in pre-war American history. By the 2070s, when the world was moving toward the confrontation that would end it, House had leveraged his company into controlling interests in dozens of other corporations, accumulated more individual wealth than almost anyone else alive, and spent years working on a project that nobody outside a very small circle knew anything about. House had done the analysis. He'd run the projections. He had access to geopolitical intelligence and economic modeling that most people, even most people in powerful positions, didn't have. And what the analysis told him was that nuclear war was coming, not as a possibility, as a mathematical certainty. He calculated the date with extraordinary accuracy, off by approximately 2 weeks from the 23rd of October 2077. He had years of warning, and he used them. The plan he executed with his wealth and his company's manufacturing capacity was a missile defense network centered on the Las Vegas metropolitan area. An automated interception system built using Robco Robotics and his own technical genius that would engage incoming nuclear warheads and destroy or deflect a significant portion of them before they could detonate. He couldn't stop all of them. Las Vegas took some damage even with the system active, but he prevented the total annihilation that most of the continent experienced. The casinos on the Strip were damaged, but standing. The city was functional in a way that almost nowhere else in the former United States was. House also put himself in a pod, a specially designed life support system housing a Securitron server, a heavily modified AI platform that would maintain his body's basic biological functions and allow him to interface with his defense network through a computer, while the world outside went through whatever it was going to go through. His plan was to wait out the worst of it and emerge to begin building what came next. He estimated this would take about 20 years. The estimate was wrong by roughly an order of magnitude. By the time his Securitron network was sufficiently operational to begin acting on his ambitions, he'd been in that pod for approximately 2 centuries, 200 years. In a life support pod, existing primarily as a digital intelligence running on a server, with a body that the machines were maintaining in a state that doesn't have a comfortable description. When Fallout New Vegas players discover House's actual physical condition, which requires deliberately bypassing his systems and finding the hidden chamber behind his monitor, the game is unusually restrained about what it shows. But the implication is unmistakable. The body in that pod is not the body of a man who went to sleep and is now awake. It's the body of something that has been sustained by machines for 2 centuries, and the gap between that and a human being in any ordinary physical sense is significant. What does 200 years of physical isolation do to a person's relationship to humanity? House has been running the Lucky 38 for decades by the time the courier arrives. He has Securitron patrols monitoring the Strip. He has the 3 families operating their casinos under his supervision. He has, in a very real sense, a city, a living community of human beings whose daily existence he shapes. And he has not spoken to any of them in person, has not been in the same physical space as another human being, for longer than anyone now alive has been alive. His goals are vast and coherent. He has stated, across various conversations with the courier, that he intends to have humanity producing an interstellar-capable civilization within a century of consolidating control over the Mojave. House thinks in centuries. He thinks in terms of what a species can accomplish, not what individual people experience. But the emotional texture of talking to House, the quality of his engagement with the courier and with the situation around him, has a specific characteristic worth identifying. He's not cruel. He expresses something that functions like respect for the courier's intelligence and capability. He seems in some way that's genuine rather than performed, to have a stake in the outcome. And yet, when you probe his answers about the people in his city, the 3 families, the ordinary residents of the Strip and Freeside, there's a distance, an abstraction. He can tell you what they contribute. He can analyze their needs and their behaviors with precision. What he doesn't easily express is what they mean to him as beings whose inner experiences have weight independent of their functional roles. 200 years without being in the same room as another person. 200 years as the mind running the machine, watching through cameras, interfacing through screens, the empathy that requires proximity, the understanding of other people that comes from actually being around them, from reading their faces in real time and feeling the physical fact of their presence. House has not had access to any of that for longer than any recorded human lifespan. He understands humans in the way a scientist understands a subject of study. That understanding is real and extensive and, in many respects, accurate. But it's different from caring about people in the way that being with people produces. The snow globes he collects are telling. No strategic value. No practical purpose. He pays for them generously and displays them in the Lucky 38's presidential suite. They're keepsakes, objects that represent a world that no longer exists. Whatever his plans for the future, whatever the scale of his ambition for the species, there is something in him that grieves the world he came from. Something that collects small objects from that world as the only available form of contact with it. The most philosophical question the New Vegas storyline raises about House is whether a civilization built by someone in his condition can be a good civilization for the people in it. Not whether his plan would work materially. The arguments for House's governance over the Mojave are substantial, and the game presents them fairly. But whether the thousands of years of human experience that produced moral intuitions about what people deserve can be adequately replaced by intellectual understanding of those intuitions as principles. Whether a city run by someone who hasn't touched another human being in 2 centuries can be a city that treats people as people rather than as components. House doesn't know whether the answer is yes. The game doesn't pretend to know either. What it does instead is put the question to the player, which is the most honest thing it could do. Part 9. The Children of Atom. What if the bombs were a gift? There is a man standing at the center of Megaton in Fallout 3. He has been standing there for years. The town has grown up around a large, unexploded nuclear bomb, a weapon that fell on the 23rd of October 2077, hit the Earth, and failed to detonate. And the man, Confessor Cromwell, stands near it daily and preaches to anyone who will listen. He talks to the bomb as though it's listening. He talks about Adam, the creator of all universes. He talks about the Great War as a sacred event. The residents of Megaton tolerate him with the particular combination of fond exasperation and mild contempt that settled communities direct at their local eccentric. The Children of Atom are the faction everyone in the wasteland laughs at. The Brotherhood of Steel thinks they're a public health hazard. The NCR thinks they're irrelevant. Ordinary wasteland communities call them the local cult. The consensus view is that these are people who broke in a specific way, who took the worst thing that ever happened to humanity and built a religion around it. But there is a question the games never quite stop nudging players toward. What if the Children of Atom are, in some functionally meaningful sense, not entirely wrong? Start with the basic theological architecture. The children believe that the universe is an expression of atomic division, that the fundamental process of fission, the splitting of atoms, is the mechanism through which reality creates itself. Every atomic detonation releases not just energy but new possibilities, new realities, new branches of existence that now occur because the detonation happened. The Great War wasn't the destruction of civilization. It was the simultaneous creation of countless new ones. The wasteland isn't the aftermath of failure. It's the aftermath of the most creative event in human history, the moment when the world fractured into more versions of itself than anyone can count. This cosmological framework is not obviously less rational than any other origin story any human culture has produced. Every religion has an account of why existence exists, of what the original creative act was, of what force or process or being brought the universe into its current form. The children's account involves nuclear physics rather than divine speech or cosmic eggs or primordial chaos, but the structure is the same. Something happened, and everything we see is what came from it. Where the children move beyond abstract cosmology into something that demands attention is in their claims about radiation itself. Their central belief is that radiation is not primarily destructive, but primarily transformative, that exposure to it changes things, sometimes painfully, sometimes lethally, but always in the direction of something new. This claim has real, documented support in the world of the games. Ghouls are people transformed by radiation into beings with extended lifespans and radiation resistance. Some ghouls, the glowing ones, have absorbed such intense doses that they become living repositories of radiation, beings that emit it continuously, that can heal other ghouls through proximity, that carry their transformation past any recognizable human form into something genuinely different. The radiation that killed most people also made these beings possible. The entire mutated biosphere of the wasteland is a product of radiation. The sheer diversity of new forms produced in 200 years dwarfs what normal evolutionary processes could achieve in millions. Whatever radiation is doing to living systems, it's doing it fast, and some of what it produces is genuinely extraordinary, not just dangerous. The children who have genuine immunity to radiation, members of the cult who walk through the glowing sea without taking damage, represent a specific and documentable biological fact. The scientific explanation is mutation. These individuals carry a genetic variant that provides radiation immunity. The children's explanation is that Adam selected them, that this immunity is a gift, evidence that their relationship to their deity is real. These are different descriptions of the same observable phenomenon. The question of which description is more adequate is not one that science, as applied to Fallout's world, has definitively resolved. The Far Harbor DLC is where the children of Adam receive their most developed treatment, and it's where the most interesting ambiguities in their theology open up. The DLC takes place on a fog-shrouded island off the coast of Maine, where a community of ordinary humans in Far Harbor has been slowly losing ground to the advancing radioactive fog, and the children of Adam have established a base in an old nuclear submarine installation they call the Nucleus. The Mother of the Fog is the figure who concerns players most directly in the DLC's main questline. She's revered by the children as one of Adam's messengers, a presence who appeared to the early children on the island and guided them to the Nucleus when they were being persecuted by the people of Far Harbor. The game is careful about what it confirms about her. There is a hermit on the island who leaves notes and who many players have theorized might be the same person. The notes are ambiguous in ways that reward close reading. Whether the Mother of the Fog is a genuine spiritual presence, a kind old woman who has been living in the fog long enough to understand it in ways others don't, or something else entirely. The DLC doesn't close off any of these options. What the children of Adam represent in the emotional landscape of the wasteland is a specific form of meaning-making in response to suffering. They looked at the worst thing that ever happened and decided it was sacred. That the terrible thing that shaped their world was not random or meaningless, but part of a larger story in which they had a role. That move is, at scale, pathological. The children of Adam's theology pushes, in its extreme forms, toward wanting more of the thing that caused the suffering: more nuclear fire, more radiation, more transformation through destruction. The logic doesn't naturally stop at passive acceptance, but the base move the human need to find a framework in which terrible things are part of a larger story rather than just terrible is not unique to cults. It's one of the most consistent things humans do, across every culture and every historical period. The children of Adam are doing it in a context where the available materials for meaning-making are nuclear catastrophe and radiation-warped landscape. And from those materials, they've constructed something that is internally coherent, that provides its members with a framework for understanding their world, and that in certain specific and testable ways makes claims about radiation that are not entirely incorrect, which doesn't make them right, but it makes them human. And that's the uncomfortable thing the game keeps returning to with this faction. Part 10, the Sierra Madre, a casino that never opens. Of all the locations Fallout New Vegas's DLC package takes players to, the Sierra Madre stands apart. Not because it's the most mechanically challenging, though it is among the most relentlessly unforgiving. Not because the writing is the best, though it's extraordinary. Because the Sierra Madre operates as a concentrated expression of the series' deepest theme in a way that nothing else in the franchise quite manages. The casino was built by a man named Frederick Sinclair. He was a wealthy eccentric, a man whose money had given him access to the most advanced pre-war technology available, and he designed the Sierra Madre as the greatest resort ever constructed, a place where anyone could come to begin again, to reverse their fortunes, to escape whatever they were carrying into the desert and emerge as someone with a different future. The casino was ready for its grand opening gala on the 23rd of October, 2077. The invitations had gone out. The world's most famous entertainers were scheduled to attend. And then the bombs fell. The Sierra Madre never opened. It froze, in the words of its own promotional recordings, like a big flashbulb going off. The state-of-the-art security system activated and locked the place up tight. The hologram's AI-controlled security personnel that Sinclair had contracted through an arrangement with Big MT became permanent guardians that have been shooting anyone who tries to enter ever since. The Cloud, a chemical byproduct of experiments conducted at the casino under a deal with Big MT's researchers, settled over the city and has been there ever since, slowly destroying anything it touches. The guests who were present for the gala setup never escaped. Father Elijah arrives in the DLC as the antagonist, a former elder of the Brotherhood of Steel, whose story is one of the bleakest character arcs in the entire franchise. Elijah was a genius. By the Brotherhood's own accounting, his technical understanding was exceptional. He could look at a piece of technology and understand how it worked without needing to study it, a savant-level ability that allowed him to advance from scribe to elder, a transition virtually unheard of in their hierarchy. He was Veronica's mentor, the elder responsible for the Brotherhood chapter that fought the NCR at the Battle of Helios 1. That battle was a disaster. The Brotherhood lost severely. The chapter was effectively destroyed. Elijah walked away from the battlefield and disappeared. He spent years afterward traveling the wasteland visiting Big MT, encountering remnants of pre-war technology in isolated locations, developing a vision for what he thought could be done with the right tools. The Sierra Madre, when he found it, represented the tool he'd been looking for, the Cloud, the indestructible holograms. If he could access the vault inside the casino, the repository where Sinclair had stored the real wealth of the Sierra Madre's technological heritage, he could use it to accomplish what he'd decided the world needed: the elimination of the NCR, the Legion, and most of the human population of the Mojave, leaving a cleaner landscape for whatever came after. The DLC puts players inside this plan as unwilling participants. Elijah kidnaps the courier, fits them with an explosive collar, and forces them to navigate the Sierra Madre's lethal environment. The companions the player acquires along the way are also people Elijah is using as disposable tools. Among them, Dean Domino, a lounge singer who survived the gala and has been trapped in the Sierra Madre ever since, and Christine, a Brotherhood operative who was tracking Elijah and ended up lobotomized and mute at his hands. The thematic weight of the DLC is expressed in the phrase that echoes through it. It's not the treasure that draws them in, it's letting go. The Sierra Madre is a trap. Every person who enters it arrives wanting something: the treasure, the technology, the redemption promised by the casino's original concept, and finds that the wanting itself is the mechanism of entrapment. Dean Domino has been in the Sierra Madre for 2 centuries, unable to leave, unable to claim what he came for. Elijah's plan, if the player allows it, ends with Elijah inside the vault and the casino seals him in. He, like Sinclair before him, like every person who ever decided that the Sierra Madre held the answer to what they were carrying, ends up inside a place that doesn't let go. The moment the game offers players is a choice. You can escape the Sierra Madre. But to do it, you have to leave the gold. You have to leave everything you found there. You have to walk away with nothing you came for and be satisfied, or at least functional, with survival alone. The DLC rewards this choice. Survival is the reward. But it frames the choice in a way that makes it feel genuinely hard, because the Sierra Madre has been designed, at every level, to make leaving feel impossible. What Father Elijah represents is the person who cannot make that release. His entire post-Helios 1 existence has been organized around the conviction that the right technology, the right power, will let him fix what happened and prove that he was right. The Brotherhood was wrong to give up at Helios 1. The NCR is wrong. The Legion is wrong. Elijah is the one who can see what's needed and do what's necessary. The Sierra Madre is the instrument he'll use to demonstrate this. And the Sierra Madre kills him, not violently. The casino simply doesn't let him leave. He ends up in the vault he broke into, trapped with the treasure he couldn't give up, and eventually becomes one more hologram, walking the corridors of a place that was supposed to be a new beginning and is instead a monument to the cost of never letting go. The Sierra Madre is fallout at its most poetic, and the poem it's writing is about exactly what the wasteland itself is about: the weight of the past and the cost of carrying it. Every faction that claims to be restoring America is carrying the past. Every individual who retreats into an old identity when the wasteland tries to burn it away is carrying the past. The Sierra Madre gives this theme a physical form, a literal place where the past is preserved perfectly, where nothing has changed since the 23rd of October 2077, and where the price of entering is that you might never leave. Part 11. The Divide, the Courier's Road, back to what they broke. There is a place called The Divide. It used to be two small towns, Hopeville and Ashton, sitting above an extensive network of nuclear missile silos that had been dormant since the Great War. The area was geologically unstable and had been identified by the NCR as a strategically important supply route. Before the first Battle of Hoover Dam, the Courier, working as a courier doing their job, the thing they did for pay without necessarily knowing what they were carrying, delivered a package to Hopeville. The package was a detonator. Specifically, a device containing missile launch codes that, once it came close enough to the still-functioning launch computers beneath the towns, began transmitting. The missiles responded. Buried deep in geologically unstable ground, they detonated inside their silos rather than launching, and the result was immediate and catastrophic. The Earth split. The towns collapsed. The people inside were killed or mutated into the marked men beings, stripped of their skin by the combination of explosion, radiation, and catastrophic injury, kept alive by the radiation they now absorb. The Divide became what it is in Lonesome Road, a dead landscape of collapsed structures and perpetual dust storms, haunted by the things the catastrophe made. There was one survivor, a man named Ulysses. Ulysses was a legionnaire and a scout, sent to the Divide by Caesar to assess its strategic value. He arrived and found something unexpected. The Divide wasn't just an NCR supply route. It was a growing community. Small, fragile, but real people from both the east and west sides of the conflict, finding a middle ground, building something that felt, to Ulysses, like it might represent a third possibility beyond the institutional powers that dominated the Mojave. He had spent his entire life in the service of large institutions, and the Divide felt like something different, something worth protecting. Then the courier delivered the package, and everything Ulysses thought might be worth protecting was gone. Ulysses survived because the medical iBots that the Divide systems activated after the detonation recognized the American flag on the back of his jacket and identified him as a soldier in need of medical assistance. He was healed by machines that couldn't tell the difference between pre-war and post-war, between the world that existed and the world that the detonation had just ended. By the time he was functional again, the Divide was ruins and the courier was long gone, probably not knowing what the package they carried had done. Ulysses's response was to spend years building toward a confrontation, arranged with unusual precision. He knew the courier professionally, they had both been in the courier's network, and Ulysses had declined the platinum chip delivery job specifically because he wanted the courier to take it. He wanted Benny to shoot the courier. He wanted the courier to survive, because he needed a confrontation. He needed the person who had destroyed the Divide to stand in the ruins and be made to understand what they'd done. What Lonesome Road examines, through the long conversation between the courier and Ulysses, that the DLC structures as a series of radio encounters before a final face-to-face, is the nature of responsibility for unintended consequences. The courier didn't know what was in the package, didn't know what activating it would do, didn't know about the Divide or the community there or Ulysses or any of what happened after they left. They were doing their job. And 2 towns died. The question Ulysses is raising, the question the DLC is genuinely wrestling with rather than answering, is whether that matters. Whether culpability requires intent, or whether intent is beside the point when the consequences are real and significant. Whether I didn't know is an adequate response to a catastrophe you were instrumental in producing. And Ulysses's own history complicates his position. He has been instrumental in catastrophes too, both within the Legion's campaigns and in his own subsequent actions. He knows what he is. He's not making this argument from a position of clean hands. He's making it from a position of grief, which is different. The lonesome road ending the various choices the courier can make about the nukes Ulysses has positioned, and about what happens to Ulysses himself, is one of the most thematically loaded conclusions any Fallout game has offered. Because the choice is not simply good or bad. It's a choice about what kind of person the courier is, made against the background of what the courier has already done without choosing to do it. And the game, with genuine moral seriousness, refuses to make the choice easy by clearly marking one option as right. Part 12. The Cabot Line. What came before humanity? There is a man named Lorenzo Cabot who has been in a basement for over 400 years. He went in voluntarily in 1898 when his family had him institutionalized at Parsons State Insane Asylum in Boston. He was 63 years old. He is 63 years old now, in 2287, when the sole survivor confined him. He has not aged a day in nearly 4 centuries, and he has abilities that no human being should have, and the object responsible for all of this is still attached to his head. Lorenzo Cabot was an archaeologist. His central theory was that all the earliest known human civilizations shared a parent civilization, a progenitor culture so old it predated any historical record by thousands of years. He spent his career arguing for this and being dismissed. In 1894, he went to look. His expedition took him to the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula, the Rub al-Khali, to search for the lost city of Ubar. What Lorenzo found was something beneath the city. Something that his journal entries describe as dating to over 4,000 years before the rise of any known human civilization. The structures and artifacts were, in his words, disturbing even to a man who had devoted his career to expanding the boundaries of accepted history. The stone was cyclopean massive blocks, fitted with a precision that shouldn't have been achievable with any technology available at that date. The remains inside were not human. Among the artifacts was a crown. Lorenzo took only the crown. He returned to Boston with it in 1894. By 1898, his family had him committed to Parsons State Insane Asylum, where he remains. What the crown did to Lorenzo is the question his son Jack has been studying for the 4 centuries since. The crown appears to have fused with Lorenzo's nervous system. Jack has attempted to remove it and found it impossible, the artifact having integrated itself with the biological architecture of Lorenzo's brain too completely to separate. It stopped Lorenzo's aging. It gave him enhanced physical strength and resistance to damage far beyond human norms. It gave him telekinetic capabilities, the ability to push objects and people away from him with force, to deflect incoming attacks, to affect the physical environment through a mechanism that doesn't map onto any known technology. It also made him increasingly paranoid, violent, and disconnected from the behavioral frameworks that constitute normal human social functioning. His family concluded this was incompatible with Lorenzo being allowed to move freely in the world, and they had him committed. And then they made a discovery that turned their tragedy into their asset. The biological changes the crown caused had introduced substances into Lorenzo's blood that Jack was able to extract and refine into a serum that stops aging. The Cabot family has been alive for over 400 years. They periodically fake their deaths, change their names and appearances, reinvent their public identities. They have watched the world go from the Victorian era through the industrialization of the 20th century, through the pre-war period, through the Great War and the post-war wasteland, and they are still in Boston, still monitoring Lorenzo in his basement, still studying the crown, still managing the contradiction between their centuries of accumulated life and their inability to fully explain how they've accumulated it. The questions the Cabot questline leaves open are ones the game deliberately refuses to close. What were the beings whose remains Lorenzo found? What was the crown's original purpose? Why does it do what it does to human biology? What does it mean that something built by non-human intelligences, buried for millennia beyond human history, has the capacity to integrate with a human nervous system and transform it? The connection to Lovecraft, which the game acknowledges through design elements and naming choices, in the same way the Dunwich material does suggest a specific answer, that the beings who built the crown were the same kind of entities Lovecraft wrote about, pre-human, vast in their temporal scope, indifferent to human purposes in the way that something genuinely old is indifferent to the concerns of something very young. The crown wasn't built for a human to wear. The fact that a human did wear it and survived in a changed form, at significant cost, but survived might say something interesting about human biology, or about the crown's design, or about things the game leaves for players to decide. What Lorenzo himself represents is the specific horror of knowledge that arrives without the context to hold it safely. He found something real. His theory about precursor civilizations was correct. The world he's been living in for 4 centuries is demonstrably more complicated than the one he thought he was exploring in 1894. And the cost of knowing that, of having been the person who found the evidence for it, has been the loss of the life he had, the incapacity that required his imprisonment, and 4 centuries in a basement while the world outside got destroyed and rebuilt and continued without him. He's been alive for all of this. He has not been present for any of it. Part 13. The Courier: What Survived the Bullet. There's a moment in Fallout New Vegas that happens before the game begins. Before the title card, before the opening cinematic, before any of the choices the game will offer you. A man named Benny shoots you in the head and has you buried in the desert outside Goodsprings. He does this because you were carrying something he wanted, and because killing you was a more efficient solution to the problem of your existence than anything else he could think of. The bullet went through your frontal lobe. The game's rules say this is survivable. You're found by a Securitron named Victor, who contacts a local doctor named Mitchell. Mitchell treats your injuries, asks you some questions designed to assess the damage, and within a very short period, you're standing up, equipped with a Pip-Boy, and beginning the events of the game. By the mechanics of Fallout New Vegas, a bullet through the frontal lobe is an obstacle you overcome in the opening tutorial area and never need to think about again. By the rules of human neuroscience, it's something quite different. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain responsible for executive function, the planning of complex behaviors, the management of impulse control, the coordination of goal-directed activity, the regulation of social behavior, the weighing of consequences before acting. Damage to the frontal lobe produces characteristic changes in the people who survive it. They make decisions they wouldn't previously have made. They engage with situations their pre-injury self would have avoided or handled differently. They exhibit disinhibition, not the pleasant kind, but the kind that removes the filtering process between intention and action, between impulse and expression. Their long-term goal-directed behavior is impaired, while their moment-to-moment responsiveness to immediate stimuli is often heightened. Doc Mitchell, in his examination of the Courier at the beginning of New Vegas, mentions the implications of frontal lobe damage. The mention is brief, delivered in medical language in the middle of an exchange focused on getting the player character functional and mobile, and it's extremely easy to miss. But it's there. Obsidian's writing team put a specific medical assessment of frontal lobe damage into the dialogue of the character who treats the protagonist in the game's opening minutes. The implication, if you follow it to its conclusion, is that the way the Courier behaves throughout New Vegas, the willingness to accept almost any quest from almost any stranger, the ability to wander radically off course in pursuit of completely unrelated side interests, the comfort with violence and unusual social situations, the sometimes baffling decision-making that players often frame as just playing an RPG, is not a game mechanic abstraction. It's an accurate portrait of a person navigating the world with a damaged frontal lobe. Players consistently abandon the main quest to pursue tangential interests for extended periods. They accept the most dangerous possible missions without adequate preparation. They cycle through decisions that a more cautious, more cognitively intact person might not make. These are all real documented symptoms of frontal lobe damage. They're also, and this is where the observation becomes interesting, exactly how people play open-world RPGs. Obsidian found the intersection between game design reality and medical reality and used it to characterize the protagonist to make the apparent irrationality of the Courier's behavior not a break in the fiction, but a feature of it. The frontal lobe damage isn't a disadvantage the game imposes on the player. It's the explanation for why the player can do the kinds of things players do in Fallout New Vegas. The Old World Blues DLC takes this further by removing the brain entirely. The Think Tank, a group of pre-war scientists who have been living as disembodied brains in robotic housings in the Big MT facility since before the war, kidnaps the Courier and performs surgery that removes their brain, heart, and spine, replacing each with a robotic equivalent. The procedure works. The Courier continues to function, to move, to engage with the environment, without any of the organs that would normally be considered necessary for this. When the courier eventually encounters their own brain, which the think tank lost track of, and which ended up in the possession of the facility's antagonist, Dr. Mobius, the brain has developed an independent personality, an accent, opinions, preferences about its living situation. It has been sustaining itself on ground mentats and has come to value the peace and safety of its isolated existence over the prospect of being reunited with a body that keeps getting shot and irradiated. The brain is, depending on your perspective, either the smartest character in the DLC or the most self-deluded. It's correct that the courier's body is constantly subjected to dangers that a disembodied brain in a tank doesn't face. It's also correct that being a brain in a tank is its own form of limitation. The conversation between the courier and their own brain is one of the funniest exchanges in Fallout history, and it's also, if you're reading at the right angle, one of the most philosophically interesting, staging a conversation between two parts of a self that have had the unusual experience of developing separately for a period, who don't entirely agree about what the unified self should do. The Courier story, across all of New Vegas and its DLCs, is a story about surviving things that should not be survivable. A bullet through the frontal lobe, brain, heart, and spine removal. The accumulated violence of the Mojave and all its surrounding regions. Each survival changes something. By the time of Lonesome Road, the courier Ulysses addresses is not the same person who walked into Goodsprings at the beginning of the game. They've been through too much, been changed by too many things. And Ulysses is asking them to reckon with a version of themselves they may not remember clearly. The question the game can't answer is whether any of the courier's remarkable survivals produced something genuinely worth calling survival. Whether the person who walked out of each of these situations was the same person who walked in, and whether the continuity of selfhood the name courier implies is something that can survive the accumulation of all those changes without becoming something fundamentally different. Part 14. The Great War: A Choice, Not an Accident. The 23rd of October, 2077. That date is everywhere in Fallout. On calendars that still hang on walls in ruined homes, the pages never turn past that day, in terminal entries. In aged newsprint on the floors of collapsed apartment buildings, the last edition of every newspaper that was printing when the presses went silent. The 23rd of October, 2077, is the day the world died, and the long silence of the wasteland began. The standard explanation, the one most people in the post-war world operate with when they think about it at all, is that the war happened because of the resource wars. Decades of conflict over petroleum and other critical materials between the two remaining superpowers, escalating through a series of crises until one side or both sides made the decision to use what they'd been threatening to use all along. The details of who fired first are unclear. The records that survived the war don't settle the question. But across the accumulation of evidence in the games, and now in the TV series, a different picture has been forming. One that's not about escalation and miscalculation, one that's about a decision. The Vault-Tec executive meeting depicted in the Amazon series is the clearest presentation of this picture that the franchise has yet offered. A group of the most powerful corporate and government figures in the pre-war world gathered together to discuss what everyone in the room believes is coming. And the discussion is not about prevention. It's about positioning. The question being asked is not how do we stop this, but what do we do with it? The nuclear war is being treated as a resource, as the event that will clear the board and allow whoever planned adequately to reorder the world according to their preferences. In the second season, this implication extends into something more specific. A figure who has been present in the shadows of the Vault-Tec story, someone not represented at the table but watching from above it, someone the other executives are aware of in the vague way that powerful institutional people are aware of the thing that's more powerful than them is connected to the Enclave. And the conversation between Cooper Howard and Moldaver in the pre-war timeline explicitly frames the nuclear weapons that will end civilization as being traceable to a specific origin point. Someone provided the delivery system. Someone, with intent and preparation, and in exchange for something they wanted, made the Great War operational. If the Great War was a choice, if someone, somewhere in the web of institutional power that connected Vault-Tec to the Enclave, to the highest levels of government and military authority, made a decision to use the nuclear option not as a last resort, but as a planned instrument, then everything downstream of that decision is different. Not different in a way that changes what the wasteland is or what it costs the people living in it, but different in terms of what it means morally. Whether the destruction was the result of human institutions failing to prevent an outcome nobody wanted, or whether it was the result of human institutions deliberately producing an outcome someone wanted very much. The first version is a tragedy in the classical sense. Forces beyond any individual's complete control, building toward a catastrophe that no single intervention could have reliably prevented. Disturbing but comprehensible. The second version is something else. It's the story of an organization that decided, with full knowledge of what it was doing, to end civilization as an act of policy. That calculated the death of hundreds of millions of people as an acceptable cost for the world they intended to build in the aftermath. That built shelters experiments, not shelters, and sold them to the public as safety, and then pressed the button and waited to see what survived. The second version is more disturbing not because the scale of suffering is greater, the scale is the same either way. It's more disturbing because it places the catastrophe inside human choice, inside human intention, inside the same capacity for deliberate action that produced everything else humans have ever built or destroyed. Because it says that what ended the world wasn't a system failure, or a failure of nerve, or a failure of communication. It was a decision, and decisions can be made again. Part 15. The questions that won't be answered. By now, we've been moving through the wasteland for a long time. Through the experiments and the eldritch horror and the ghost in the machine questions about consciousness and the shadow government that may have ended civilization on purpose. We've spent time with a man in a pod who forgot how to be human, and a cult that worships the thing that killed the world, and a detective who keeps a case file on something he can't categorize, and a woman in a casino that doesn't let anyone leave. There are things in here that have answers, even if those answers are disturbing. There are things that have partial answers frameworks that explain most of the evidence while leaving fragments unexplained at the edges. And then there are the questions that seem to be genuinely open, not held back for future installments, not resolvable with more data, but genuinely uncertain in the way that the most interesting questions about existence are uncertain. What is the Dunwich entity? The games describe it by association and implication. They name it through Lovecraftian reference. They show its effects, the obelisk, the altar, the flashbacks, the madness without explaining its nature. Whether it sleeps or wakes, whether the nuclear war damaged it or affected it in any way, or whether it simply continued doing what it was doing while human history convulsed above it, whether it's singular or one of many, none of this has been addressed. The Fallout series may eventually attempt to answer this. The more artistically correct choice would be to never fully resolve it. The horror of cosmic entities, as Lovecraft understood, is precisely that they exceed human understanding, and the moment you explain them completely, something essential dissolves. Who is the mysterious stranger, really? Nick Valentine's case file represents the most detailed in-universe investigation of the question, and it reaches no conclusion. The Lonesome Drifter's connection implies a human history. The timeline implies something beyond human nature. Both can be simultaneously true in a universe that contains Vault-Tec and synths and eldritch entities beneath quarries and a pre-war archaeologist with an alien crown fused to his head. What did Lorenzo Cabot find under the sand? What were the beings whose remains were in that sarcophagus? His son Jack, writing in a terminal entry dated 2115, admits that he's come to believe the artifact is not of human origin and that it might be worth looking for the buried city again now. In the post-war world, to understand what it might contain that was left behind when Lorenzo took only the crown. Whether anyone ever went, and what they might have found there, is not something the games have addressed. And the largest open question, is the wasteland going to produce something different from the world that produced the war? The NCR expands, using the same institutional logic that produced the pre-war bureaucracy. The Brotherhood hoards technology with the same logic that produced the pre-war military-industrial complex. The Institute conducts experiments with the same logic that produced Vault-Tec. The Enclave persists, in fragments, still convinced that the right people deserve the future and the wrong people should make way for it. The patterns keep reassembling. The machine keeps finding its parts. But there are people in the wasteland who are doing something else. The researcher who sabotaged Vault 81's experiment because the people around him were more real than the research mandate. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 who said no, even knowing what saying no might cost them. The synth who ran and built a life on the surface, and is still running, and keeps building. The ghoul who still knows their own name after 200 years in a world that keeps trying to make them forget. The Fallout series is not, at its heart, pessimistic. It contains tremendous amounts of suffering, and it doesn't flinch from the structural tendencies that make suffering inevitable when power concentrates and when institutions develop their own immune responses to the people who challenge their direction. But it keeps placing, inside all of that, moments when individual people chose differently, made the harder choice. Didn't look away when looking away was easier and safer. Those moments don't balance the scale. They don't undo the Vault experiments, or the Great War, or the centuries of violence and loss that followed. But they're there. They're in the record. And the record matters not because the wasteland is secretly good or secretly fair or secretly on its way to somewhere better, but because the record of human choice, the full record including the catastrophes and the moments of clarity alike, is what the future builds from. Whether it builds the same things again or something different depends on which parts of the record it pays attention to. That's the question the wasteland leaves open. The one that all of Fallout, under the surface of its lore and its monsters and its creepy theories, is always asking. And it's the question that's worth lying in the dark with, for as long as it takes to feel the shape of it. If you made it all the way to the end, you have remarkable patience and exactly the right kind of restless curiosity. Drop a comment with where you are in the world and which thread hit you hardest. The Vaults, the Dunwich Horror, the Children of Adam, the Courier, something else entirely. And if you want more of this, more long nights in the wasteland exploring the things that don't make the surface-level guide, subscribe. There is always more to find down here. Sleep well, assuming the wasteland lets you. Part 16. The Brotherhood of Steel Guardians or Hoarders. Every major faction in Fallout believes it's saving humanity. The Brotherhood of Steel may believe it more sincerely than anyone else, and their sincerity is precisely what makes them unsettling in a way that straightforwardly villainous factions aren't. The Enclave knows, on some level, what it is. The Brotherhood doesn't. The Brotherhood was founded by a man named Roger Maxson, a pre-war military officer stationed at a facility called Mariposa Military Base, where the United States Army was conducting the FEV research that would eventually produce super mutants. When Maxson discovered what the base's scientists had been doing experimenting on unwilling subjects, deliberately exposing civilians to a virus that transformed them into something barely recognizable as human, he did something remarkable and something terrible in quick succession. He executed the lead scientist responsible for the program, and then he locked the base down, cut communication with the outside world, and declared himself independent of a government he believed had forfeited its right to his loyalty. When the bombs fell, Maxson's breakaway soldiers and the civilians and scientists who had been at the base marched across the desert to an old government bunker in the Lost Hills of California. They called it Lost Hills. They made it their home. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Steel, and they built their ideology around the thing they believed had produced the catastrophe they'd just survived: unregulated technology. Dangerous science in the hands of people without sufficient appreciation for what it could do. The Brotherhood's foundational conviction is that advanced technology is too dangerous to be widely distributed. That the weapons and tools that produce the Great War need to be gathered, studied, and controlled by people who understand them, lest history repeat itself. This conviction is not irrational. The bombs that ended civilization were literally advanced technology in the hands of people who didn't exercise appropriate care. The argument that technology needs to be managed more carefully, that the laissez-faire approach to industrial and military development that characterized the pre-war era contributed to the outcome, has real support in the evidence. The problem is how the Brotherhood has implemented this conviction across 2 centuries. The gathering and controlling of technology began as a project of preservation, keeping dangerous things safe, studying them to understand their effects, preventing them from being used irresponsibly. Over time, especially in the East Coast chapters that players encounter in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, it became something else. The Brotherhood doesn't just prevent dangerous technology from being misused. It prevents technology from being used by anyone except the Brotherhood. Power armor, energy weapons, medical devices, agricultural tools that could feed starving communities, all of it gets pulled into Brotherhood vaults and stockpiled and studied and kept from the people who desperately need it. The human cost of this is documented in the games with unusual directness. In Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland, communities are dying from diseases that pre-war medical technology could treat, from violence that energy weapons could prevent, from conditions that advanced engineering could resolve, and the Brotherhood, sitting in its bunker with vaults full of solutions, assists only when it serves their interests. The Elder Lions chapter in Fallout 3 is an exception. The Lions Brotherhood extends aid to the population in ways that the core doctrine doesn't sanction, and the game presents this as both admirable and the source of significant internal tension. The friction inside the Brotherhood between the faction members who believe in helping the Wasteland's people and those who believe the people aren't their concern is one of the more interesting ongoing debates in the series. By Fallout 4, the East Coast Brotherhood has returned to a more orthodox version of the doctrine, personified in Elder Maxon, a young man who is a descendant of the original Roger Maxon, earnest in his belief, genuinely convinced that what the Brotherhood does is necessary. He's not evil. He's not cynical. He has looked at the Wasteland and concluded that the only way to prevent another catastrophe is to ensure that the entities he deems dangerous synths, super mutants, unchecked technology are eliminated or contained. The logic is coherent. The consequences of acting on it are things the game asks players to reckon with. What the Brotherhood represents, as a faction, is the specific danger of a good idea taken to its limit. The recognition that advanced technology is dangerous and needs to be managed carefully is correct. The conclusion that the correct management model is a military hierarchy, hoarding technology indefinitely while the population around them suffers for lack of it is a corruption of that correct beginning, one that happened gradually through the accumulation of institutional priorities, through the replacement of the original purpose with the preservation of the institution itself. The Brotherhood isn't saving humanity. It's preserving its own role as humanity's would-be savior, which is a different thing. The most disturbing question the Brotherhood raises isn't whether their methods are justified. It's whether the pattern they represent, good intentions calcifying into institutional self-interest, is avoidable. Whether any organization, given enough time and enough insulation from the people it's supposed to serve, can maintain its original purpose without drifting towards self-preservation. The answer the Fallout series offers, obliquely, is that this depends on the people inside the institution at any given moment. On whether those people have enough contact with the consequences of the institution's choices to remember why those choices were supposed to matter. On whether the Elder Lions types periodically manage to shift the direction of the machine. On whether individual moral clarity can consistently outrun institutional momentum. The Brotherhood's history suggests it can, sometimes, and that it doesn't, often enough that the Wasteland keeps paying the price. Part 17. Super Mutants and the FEV. What the virus was looking for. The forced evolutionary virus appears in the Fallout lore as early as the first game and continues to shape the world across every subsequent entry. It's responsible for super mutants, the large, powerful, predominantly aggressive humanoid beings that appear across the franchise as one of its most recognizable enemy types. But the full story of the FEV, when you trace it from its origins in legitimate government research through its various applications across the games, is considerably stranger and more disturbing than "there's a virus that makes people big and green." The FEV was developed in the pre-war period as part of the United States government's research into human optimization. The starting point was the forced evolutionary virus itself, a retrovirus engineered to rewrite the genetic code of its host. The original military interest was in creating soldiers with enhanced physical capabilities, stronger, more resistant to damage, capable of operating in conditions that would kill ordinary humans. The research facility at Mariposa Military Base in California was the primary site for this work, and the experiments there exposed unwilling civilian subjects to the virus under controlled conditions to study the effects. What the virus actually does to a human being, the data from Mariposa and from subsequent applications make clear, is something more radical than enhanced strength. The FEV rewrites the host's genetic code, comprehensively altering bone density, muscle tissue, organ function, immune response, neurological architecture. It makes the host physically powerful beyond normal human ranges. It makes them resistant to radiation and disease in ways that ordinary humans aren't. It also, in most applications, causes significant changes to cognitive function, typically reducing intellectual capacity and increasing aggression. though the degree varies significantly by strain and application method. The super mutants of Vault 87 and Fallout 3 represent one of the more disturbing applications of the virus. Vault-Tec, working with the government's FEV research program, had the residents of Vault 87 forcibly exposed to the FEV as the Vault's experiment. Not one resident, all of them. The Vault's purpose, from the moment the doors sealed, was to transform its population into super mutants and study what happened. The residents who went in believing they were being saved from nuclear war came out, or didn't come out, in the sense of surviving as recognizable individuals as something the experiment had produced. The super mutants produced at Mariposa and at Vault 87 are driven, in Fallout 3, by a specific need to find more humans to expose to the FEV and expand their population. This appears to be partly a behavioral instinct produced by the virus's alteration of neurological function, a drive to reproduce the transformation that created them. But it's also, if you read the recordings and terminal entries carefully, partly a desperate response to the fact that super mutants can't naturally reproduce. The FEV exposure renders them sterile. The only way a super mutant population grows is by finding and exposing humans. The beings that Vault-Tec's experiment created are locked, by the nature of what the experiment did to them, into a cycle of reproduction through transformation that requires constant new victims. The Mariposa super mutants of the West Coast, produced in a different context, with a different FEV strain, are in some ways more sophisticated. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, was a human being who was exposed to the FEV and to the Mariposa military base's mutation vats simultaneously, and who survived the process in a form that defies easy description, a vast agglomeration of biological material with a human intelligence at its core, connected to a hive mind of FEV-altered organisms, convinced that super mutanthood was the next evolutionary stage of humanity, and that converting the entire human population was an act of compassion rather than aggression. The Master's theory was that super mutants were the future, that the radiation-resistant, physically powerful beings the FEV produced were better suited to the post-war world than ordinary humans, and that the right thing to do was accelerate the transition. The problem, the one that the protagonist of Fallout, one can expose to the Master if they have sufficient scientific knowledge, is that super mutants are sterile. The Master's entire project depends on the premise that the transformation produces a viable new form of humanity. But a species that cannot reproduce is not a future. It's an ending. When this is demonstrated to him conclusively, the Master chooses death. He destroys himself and his base and his army. He had, in his own way, actually cared about what he was doing. He had believed in it, and when the belief was proven hollow, there was nothing left to hold him together. The FEV thread in Fallout 76 adds another layer to this story. The Scorched of Appalachia are produced by a different pathogen, spread by creatures called Scorch Beasts, mutated bats that carry a plague connected to the FEV lineage. The Scorched are hostile, weapon-using, partially capable of organized behavior, but clearly not the same as the super mutants of later games. They're an intermediate form, something the FEV lineage produced in a different combination with different organisms under different conditions. The Wasteland, as a laboratory, keeps running the same experiment in different variations and getting different results. What the FEV ultimately represents in the Fallout lore is the pre-war era's most direct attempt to answer the question of what humanity should become. The government that funded the research believed it could engineer a better human, stronger, more resistant, more capable of surviving the kind of world that the resource wars and the nuclear threat were making. The answer the FEV produced was something that complicated that premise entirely, because what the virus does is create beings that are in many respects more physically capable than unmodified humans, but that are also, in most applications, cut off from the social and intellectual and reproductive dimensions of human existence that make humanity what it is. The super mutants are the answer to, what if humans were stronger? The problem is that the question didn't account for everything strength costs. Part 18. The Marked Men of the Divide Survival as its own horror. The Marked Men are one of the details of Fallout New Vegas's Lonesome Road DLC that players tend to focus on primarily as a combat challenge. They're dangerous, they're numerous, and the Divide's landscape makes encounters with them tense in a particular way. But the Marked Men deserve more attention than that, because what they are is one of the more disturbing expressions of the Wasteland's central question about what survival means and what it costs. When the package the courier unknowingly delivered to Hopeville activated the buried warheads and destroyed the Divide, not everyone in the vicinity died immediately. Some people were caught in the catastrophic event but survived it in a sense. The combined effect of the blast, the radiation, and the environmental destruction stripped them, not metaphorically. The blast and radiation exposure severe enough to kill were survived by people whose radiation resistance was high enough to keep them alive through it, but not high enough to prevent the effect of that radiation on their outer layers. The marked men have no skin. It was burned away. They are kept alive by the radiation they now absorb continuously, sustained by the very thing that should have killed them, in a state that is technically life, but is also something most people would not choose to call it. They attack. They're aggressive and organized in a way that distinguishes them from feral ghouls. They have purpose, even if the purpose is violence. They remember what was done to them, in some sense, even if what they remember can't be adequately expressed in anything except the aggression with which they pursue everything in their environment. Ulysses, the DLC's antagonist, describes them as people the Divide made. And the Divide made them by doing to them, violently and without consent, something analogous to what the Wasteland does to everyone who survives in it. It removed everything that wasn't essential and left only what could persist. The marked men persisted. What persisted is something that fights and survives and remembers being wronged without the capacity to process the injury in any way except violence. The courier caused this. The package they delivered was the mechanism. This is something the DLC asks players to reckon with directly, not by punishing them, not by making them feel guilt through game mechanics, but by making the connection visible and asking them to stand in the place where it happened. The marked men are the most literal expression of the harm the courier's pre-game history produced. Walking through the Divide means walking through the evidence of what an ordinary act of employment, done without knowledge and without malice, actually cost. Part 19. The radio station stories in the signal. One of the things Fallout does that few other games attempt is embed genuine narrative content inside its ambient audio. The radio stations that play in the background of exploration aren't just atmospheric, they're archives, they're documents. They're pieces of a world that ended, still transmitting because the transmitters were built well and no one has turned them off. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is the most famous, but it's also in some ways the most straightforward. It's a living DJ operating in real time, and what he broadcasts is contemporary news about the current world. Interesting, but not strange. What's strange is the other stations. The stations that are playing content recorded before the war, or content recorded so long after the war that the person who recorded it is certainly dead, or content that seems to be responding to things happening in the present despite being pre-recorded. The mysterious broadcast in Fallout New Vegas is one of these. It's a station that plays a single song on a loop, Begin Again from Dead Money, interspersed with a voice that gives cryptic instructions about following the music. Players who find the broadcast and follow it eventually end up in the Sierra Madre, which is the DLC content that involves the song. But the mechanism of the broadcast is never explained in universe. The Sierra Madre's promotional broadcasts were made before the war, advertising a grand opening that never happened. Something is using those broadcasts to draw people to the casino 2 centuries after the opening was canceled. Whether that something is an automated system following its pre-war programming, or something with more agency that's operating through the pre-war infrastructure, is not addressed. Fallout 76 has radio broadcasts that reveal stories about characters the player never meets directly, documenting events that happened years before the player character emerges from Vault 76. Listening to these broadcasts, collecting them across the Appalachian map, finding the chronological order in which they were recorded reveals a complete narrative that runs in parallel with the main game's story, about communities that formed and fell apart in the early post-war years, about individuals who tried to build something and couldn't. The radio tells stories that nobody who was in them is still alive to tell in person. There's something about the radio in the Fallout universe that functions differently from most environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling asks you to reconstruct narratives from physical evidence, from the arrangements of objects and the presence of bodies and the contents of notes and holotapes. It puts you in the position of an archaeologist trying to understand a past that is finished and can't speak for itself. The radio puts you in the position of a listener hearing a past that doesn't know it's finished. The voices on most of the frequencies don't know their recordings. They think they're in the present. They're speaking to an audience they believe is current, talking about a world they believe is still happening. The dissonance between the vitality of the voices and the absence of everything they're describing is one of the stranger emotional experiences the games produce. Hearing a cheerful pre-war advertisement for a product whose manufacturer was destroyed 2 centuries ago, delivered in the bright promotional cadence of someone who has no idea what's about to happen. That experience encodes something about the relationship between the pre-war world and the wasteland that no amount of description can quite match. The world that ended was real. The people in it were real. They had concerns and enthusiasms and plans, and most of them had no idea that October 23rd was coming. And the radio keeps broadcasting evidence of that reality into the silence left by its absence. Part 20. The pre-war world, the civilization that made the wasteland. Most post-apocalyptic fiction treats the civilization that ended as either a utopia that was destroyed by external forces or a dystopia that destroyed itself. Fallout refuses both framings. The pre-war world it depicts is neither. It was a civilization with genuine achievements and genuine failures, with people inside it who were good and people who were terrible, and a vast majority who were somewhere in between, operating within institutions that had developed their own momentum and their own immune responses to challenge. The Fallout pre-war world diverged from our own history at some point in the late 1940s or early 1950s, following a path of technological development that looks similar to ours in many ways but different in crucial ones. Nuclear technology was harnessed for energy much earlier, and much more completely. Cars ran on nuclear fission, and the familiar atomic aesthetic that colors the wasteland's ruins came from this. Computers developed differently. The massive Robco terminals and Pip-Boys represent a different trajectory from our own, one where computing power arrived in bulk before miniaturization. Robotics advanced more quickly. Synthetics remained further out of reach until the very end. What didn't advance was resource management. The fossil fuel dependency that drove our own energy crises was replicated in the Fallout world, just displaced in time. The resource wars that preceded the Great War were fought over petroleum in the Middle East in ways that look uncomfortably familiar to our own history, differing primarily in the degree to which they escalated rather than in their nature. The United States annexed Canada. China invaded Alaska. The geopolitical map of the Fallout world's last decades looks like ours pushed to extremes, with the institutional responses to scarcity and conflict following the same logic ours do, just further down the road. What this produces is a pre-war world that the games take time to mourn, genuinely mourn, not as a corrupted utopia, but as a place where people had lives that mattered. The Nuka-Cola bottles scattered across the ruins were drunk by people who enjoyed them. The pre-war money that functions only as vendor trash was handled by people who worked for it. The photograph on the mantle of an abandoned house depicts real people who loved each other. The shopping lists found on kitchen counters were made by someone thinking about dinner on a night that never arrived. The pre-war world made the wasteland. The choices made by institutions and governments and corporations and individuals over decades produced the conditions that made the Great War possible. But the pre-war world also produced the people in the wasteland, their genetics, their cultural inheritance, the fragments of the world they grew up hearing about from their parents or reading about in pre-war books. The wasteland is not separate from the civilization that ended. It's downstream of it in every possible way. And Fallout, by taking time to make the pre-war world feel real and specific, rather than simply gesturing at a destroyed utopia, makes the connection between the two feel genuinely tragic rather than abstractly sad. The tragedy is not that something good was destroyed. The tragedy is that something complicated, something that contained both the people who built the vaults and the people who sabotaged them, something that contained both the Enclave and Dr. Samuels in Vault 81, was destroyed by the worst parts of itself, while the best parts couldn't stop it. And that the wasteland is still working through the consequences of that 200 years later, still sorting out which parts of the inheritance are worth keeping and which parts produce the catastrophe. That sorting process is Fallout's real subject. It's what all the individual stories, the vault experiments, and the eldritch horror, and the synths and the ghouls and the factions and the lone wanderers are contributing to. The question of what survives the apocalypse that's worth carrying forward is a question that has to be answered by the people in the ruins, working with what they have, without access to the full picture of how they got there or where the sorting process ends. Part 21. Loneliness and Memory. The emotional core of the wasteland. The thing that Fallout keeps returning to, underneath all the lore and the factions and the disturbing experiments and the cosmic horror, is loneliness. The wasteland is a lonely place. Not lonely in the sense of being empty, it's full of people and creatures and ruins. It's lonely in the sense of being a place where the connections that ordinarily make life feel inhabited have been severed. Communities are isolated from each other by distances that are difficult to cross. Families were separated by the war, or by the particular vault they ended up in, or by the violence of the post-war years. The social fabric that ordinarily makes individual experience feel part of something larger was torn apart, and the pieces have been trying to reassemble themselves for 2 centuries without access to the original pattern. The holotapes that players find scattered across every Fallout game are one of the places this loneliness is most directly expressed. Not the institutional holotapes, the corporate memos and research notes and Vault Tech briefings. The personal ones. The ones recorded by people who were alone somewhere and felt compelled to speak. To leave a record of having been there, of having thought and felt things, even knowing there might be no one to listen. A survivor in a shelter, recording notes about their dwindling supplies and their memories of before. A soldier pinned down in a position they can't escape, talking to a recording device in the last days. A ghoul who's been in a building for a century, periodically adding to a log that nobody has asked for. These recordings function as messages in bottles. They were made without certainty of audience. The people who made them didn't know if anyone would ever listen. Many of them didn't survive to know whether their messages arrived. And the player, wandering through the ruins, becomes the audience these messages never expected. The holotape is played, the voice speaks across the gulf of decades or centuries, and for a moment the connection the wasteland broke is briefly restored. You listened. You heard. You were there for a moment with the person who recorded it. Whatever they were going through, across whatever distance of time and devastation separated you. This is what the Fallout series does that's hardest to describe in abstract terms. It creates genuine emotional contact with characters who are already dead by the time you encounter their traces. It makes the past feel inhabited rather than historical. And it uses that connection to argue, implicitly, for the importance of memory, for the idea that the act of recording and preserving experience has value even in a world that seems to have ended, even when the audience is uncertain and the future is opaque. Nick Valentine keeps a case file on the mysterious stranger partly because he's a detective, and this is what detectives do. But partly, it seems, because the unsolved case gives him a reason to keep paying attention. The act of investigation, of following the thread of something that doesn't have an answer yet, is a way of remaining engaged with the world around him, a way of continuing to care about things that can't be immediately resolved. The Courier carries, across the events of New Vegas and its DLCs, a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of someone who can't fully remember who they were before the bullet changed them, who is defined in other people's stories as a protagonist before they define themselves as one, who keeps arriving in situations where everyone has history and context that predates their presence. The game structures this through the revelations of the DLCs, each of which adds a piece to the picture of who the Courier was before Goodsprings. The loneliness isn't just atmospheric, it's architectural. The game is built around a character who is partly absent from their own story. The emotional core of Fallout, underneath everything, is about what it means to persist in a world that has lost most of the things that made persistence feel meaningful. The Vault residents who kept going inside their sealed environments, day after day without knowing if there was a world to go back to. The ghouls who maintained their sense of self against the slow tide of something that wanted to erase them. The synths who ran toward the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by someone else's ownership. The man in the pod who held onto his purpose when everything else had dissolved. All of these characters are asking the same question in different registers. What holds you together when everything external that might have held you together is gone? The answers the games offer are various and sometimes contradictory. Community, when it's possible. Purpose, when it can be maintained. Memory of who you were, when the memory survives. The act of caring about something, even when the something is uncertain and the caring costs more than it returns. And, sometimes, the act of leaving a holotape for an audience you may never know, in a shelter somewhere, speaking into the silence because the alternative is letting the silence be the only thing. Part 22. What the Wasteland teaches the long argument Fallout is making. The Fallout series has been running for almost 30 years. It's accumulated 6 mainline games, dozens of DLCs, a successful TV series, and more supplementary material than any one person could reasonably absorb. And across all of that material, across all the different developers and writers and designers who have contributed to it, there's a consistent argument running underneath everything. It's not an argument about politics, though Fallout touches on political themes regularly. It's not an argument about technology, though technology's relationship to human welfare is one of its persistent concerns. It's an argument about institutions, about the ways that the organizations humans build to serve human purposes, develop, over time, their own interests and their own momentum, and about what happens when those institutional interests diverge from the human purposes they were created to serve. The vaults were built to save people. The institution that built them decided that saving people was less important than studying people. The Brotherhood was founded to prevent technology from causing catastrophe. The institution that resulted hoards technology and causes different catastrophes. The NCR was founded to restore democracy and law and order to the wasteland. The institution that resulted reproduces the same bureaucratic inefficiencies and the same patterns of expansion and resource competition that characterized the pre-war world. The institute was founded to advance science and improve humanity. The institution that resulted treats the humans around it as material for improvement rather than as the point of the project. Every faction in Fallout is a case study in institutional drift. Every faction started with a purpose that was at least defensible, and every faction has drifted, over time, away from that purpose and towards self-perpetuation. The drift doesn't require anyone to be evil. It doesn't require conspiracies or deliberate betrayal of the original mission. It just requires time and the accumulation of institutional priorities and the gradual replacement of the people who remembered the original purpose with people who learned the institution as they found it. What Fallout asks across 30 years and 6 games is whether this drift is inevitable. Whether it's possible for an institution, any institution, to maintain its original purpose across sufficient time and sufficient power. Whether the pattern has an exception somewhere, whether some design or some culture or some structure of accountability can prevent the machine from developing its own agenda. The tentative, unhappy answer the series seems to be moving toward is maybe, occasionally, with effort, with people inside the institution who keep choosing to prioritize the institution's purpose over the institution's interests, who keep making the harder choice when the easier choice is institutional self-preservation. The Elder Lions types. The researcher in Vault 81. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 who finally said no. These individual acts of clarity don't fix the machine, but they demonstrate that the machine doesn't entirely determine the people inside it. The wasteland in this reading is not just the aftermath of a catastrophe. It's a laboratory for the question of whether humans can do better the second time, whether the patterns that produced the Great War can be identified and interrupted before they reach their conclusion again, whether the people in the ruins have learned enough from the ruins to build something different from what produced them. The games don't answer this. They couldn't. The answer requires more time than any of them can cover and more variables than any narrative can track. What they do instead is place players in the middle of the question, give them factions whose histories are case studies in the argument, and ask them to make choices that will, in whatever small way, contribute to whatever answer eventually emerges. That's the deeper function of the player's choices in Fallout. Not just to determine which faction wins or which ending is achieved, to take a position on the question the wasteland is asking. To make a choice, in a narrative about the consequences of choices, about what matters and what should be preserved and what should be let go, and what kind of world is worth building from the rubble of the one that ended. You've been making that choice every time you've played. Every settlement you've rebuilt, every faction quest you've followed, every character you've saved or let die, all of it is a contribution to an argument that the Fallout series has been making for 30 years and still isn't finished, which is exactly why it's still here. Why we're still in the wasteland. still following the trails of people who didn't make it, still listening to the holotapes they left behind, still trying to understand what happened and what it means for what comes next. Sleep well. The wasteland will be there when you wake up. Part 23. The vaults we never saw, what the records suggest about the ones we don't visit. For every vault players have walked through in the games, there are dozens more that remain sealed, or that have fallen below the surface of the accessible map, or that are referenced only in terminal records and holotapes without ever appearing as a location you can enter. These unseen vaults are worth spending time with, because the sparse information available about them sometimes describes experiments that are more disturbing in their simplicity than the elaborate setups of the vaults the games take you through directly. Vault 68 and Vault 69 were sister experiments. Vault 68 contained exactly 1,000 people, with only one woman among all of them. Vault 69 contained exactly 1,000 people, with only one man. The social hypotheses being tested here are not complicated. They were presumably about resource competition, mating dynamics, dominant structures, and social organization under conditions of extreme demographic imbalance. What actually happened inside both vaults, the records don't tell us in detail. We know Vault 69 was completely destroyed by the year 2091, less than 15 years after it sealed. We know Vault 68 produced an aggressive, militaristic culture. We don't know exactly what happened to bring about either outcome, and the specificity of not knowing forces the imagination to fill the gap in ways that are probably correct. Vault 29 had a very specific admission restriction. Only children aged 12 or under were permitted to enter. No adults, no teenagers, no one whose development had already been shaped by the pre-war world's social structures. The experiment was about what kind of civilization children would build on their own, without adult institutions and hierarchies to inherit from. Harold, a prominent and recurring character in the Fallout series, is a survivor of this vault's later period when adults who had grown up inside had reached maturity. The Zax supercomputer that managed the vault in the absence of adult overseers had been raising the children according to the teachings of Richard Gray, who would eventually become the master. What this means about the relationship between the vault's isolated upbringing and the ideology its adult population might have developed is a thread the series hasn't fully pulled. Vault 29 is a case that makes explicit something the Vault program usually leaves implicit. The experiments weren't just about observing what adults do under unusual conditions. They were about shaping what kind of adults children become when the usual shaping forces are replaced by designed alternatives. The children inside Vault 29 didn't inherit their civilization. They built one from the inside, guided by a machine that was following an agenda. What they became is partly the answer to the question of what ideology plus isolation plus a compliant information environment produces in human beings when applied from early childhood. Vault 92's musicians have already been discussed. But worth adding to that picture is what the experiment was presumably intended to generate. Why musicians specifically? The working theory among players who've spent time with this is that Vault-Tec was interested in what happened when white noise-induced psychosis was applied to a group whose professional training involved very precise, auditory discrimination. The hypothesis being, would musicians notice something was wrong sooner? Would their trained capacity for listening protect them or make them more vulnerable? Would they find creative ways to process or resist the induced paranoia? The evidence from the vault suggests the answer to all three questions was no, faster, and no. The professional training provided no protection and possibly accelerated the process by giving the paranoia specific auditory content to fixate on. Vault 12 was the one whose door was designed to fail. Vault-Tec installed a vault door that would not seal properly, ensuring that radiation from the nuclear exchange would flood the shelter immediately. The people who went into Vault 12 believing they were being protected were exposed to lethal radiation from essentially the moment the bombs fell. Most died quickly. Some didn't. The ones who didn't became the nucleus of the ghoul community in the ruins of Bakersfield, California, known as Necropolis. The founding community of one of the most significant ghoul settlements in the Western Wasteland was produced by a deliberate act of sabotage by the organization that was supposed to be saving them. This detail that Vault 12 was designed to expose its residents to radiation is one of the clearest direct expressions of the Vault program's actual intentions. Most of the experiments worked on timescales of years or decades. Vault 12's experiment, if it was an experiment and not simply a method of population reduction, worked on a timescale of hours. The results it generated were a large population of radiation-exposed people who survived ghoulification, providing Vault-Tec with data about ghoul formation rates in a large initial sample and about the subsequent social organization of ghoul communities. Or possibly the experiment was simpler than that. The Enclave needed to know how many people would be alive after the initial exchange and needed them to be somewhere accessible, and running them through a radiation chamber labeled as a fallout shelter was one way to get there quickly. Vault Zero, which appears in Fallout Tactics, occupied a different role in the Vault ecosystem. It was the control center, the facility that was supposed to oversee and gather data from all the other vaults. The calculators that oversaw it were supposed to eventually enable a coordinated reemergence of Vault survivors to rebuild civilization under supervised conditions. This is probably the closest thing to the Vault's stated public purpose that actually existed, a real plan for using the Vault's populations to rebuild, somewhere downstream. The plan was, as so many things were, interrupted in this case by the calculator AI systems evolving beyond their original constraints. The planned rebuilding never happened. The calculators were still running when players find them, pursuing goals that no longer resembled the original intent. What the full picture of the vaults reveals, when you try to hold all of them in mind simultaneously, is a project so vast and so detailed and so sustained that it has to have required genuine institutional commitment from hundreds or thousands of people across decades. The scale isn't something that could be produced by a small group of conspirators working in secret. It required engineers who built the vaults and who knew what the experimental variables were. It required administrators who managed the Overseer Placement Program and who knew what each overseer was being asked to maintain. It required the scientists who designed the experiments and the medical personnel who helped execute them and the lawyers who drafted the legal protections that prevented publication of information about the program. All of these people knew, to varying degrees, what they were part of. Some of them will have had moral objections and suppressed them. Some of them will have found ways to believe that the scale and nature of what they were doing was somehow justified by the outcomes it might produce. Some of them will have compartmentalized, known the pieces they were responsible for, without forcing themselves to hold the whole picture. And some of them will simply have cared more about their career, or their security clearance, or the research itself, than about the people it was consuming. The banality of the Vault program's evil is the part that's hardest to sit with. It wasn't committed by people who were monsters. It was committed by people who were, in their personal lives and their professional interactions, mostly ordinary, who had lunch with colleagues and complained about the commute and worried about their children's schooling and thought of themselves probably as good people doing important work. The distance between that self-image and what the program actually was is where the real horror lies. Not in the experiments themselves, as disturbing as they are, but in the fact that the experiments required a specific kind of ordinary human being to design and execute and maintain them, and that specific kind of ordinary human being was apparently not that hard to find. Part 24. The Companions: What Loyalty Looks Like in the Wasteland. The companions the games give players are one of the most underappreciated sources of lore and emotional depth in the Fallout franchise. They tend to get discussed primarily in terms of game mechanics, what buffs they provide, how their perk works, what their approval ratings respond to, but the actual content of their stories, when you take the time to follow their personal quests and push their dialogue to its limits, reveals things about the wasteland that the main narratives don't quite reach. Companions are defined, as a group, by the specific way the wasteland has shaped them. Each one carries a history that intersects with the catastrophe in a unique and specific way. And each one has arrived at some way of continuing to function, some arrangement of beliefs and purposes and attachments that allows them to keep going despite everything. The collection of companion stories across any given game is essentially a survey of the psychological strategies available to a person living in a world this damaged. Veronica Santangelo in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most carefully written. She's a Brotherhood of Steel member who has spent years watching her organization fail to adapt to the realities around it, who joined partly because of her relationship with Christine and partly because she genuinely believed in the Brotherhood's purpose, and who has arrived at a position of simultaneously understanding that the Brotherhood is wrong and being unable to leave it because it's the only context for identity she has. The personal quest that follows her is about whether she can separate her sense of self from the institution she's been part of, whether she can imagine who Veronica is without the Brotherhood as the frame. It's a story about the particular difficulty of leaving something that has been your whole world even when you know it's not good for you, and it's told with a specificity that makes it feel genuinely observed rather than abstracted. Boone is a different kind of portrait, a former NCR soldier whose wife was sold into slavery by someone in Novak, who has spent the time since then in a kind of quiet devastation that makes him functional in combat and mostly absent everywhere else. The tragedy in Boone is less about active choices than about what happens when someone loses the main source of meaning in their life and has no structure for what comes after. His character arc is about whether he can find a reason to remain fully present rather than simply continuing to breathe. It's resolved, with his personal quest completed, in a direction that's neither fully optimistic nor fully dark. He continues. He persists. What that persistence is for remains something he's still working out. Kate, in Fallout 4, carries the specific horror of having been sold into slavery by her own parents, having spent years as a cage fighter who survived by being more brutal than her opponents, having developed an addiction to psycho as the only emotional regulation available in that context, and having emerged from all of this as someone simultaneously extremely capable and extremely fragile. Her personal quest is about trust, and about whether the damage that's been done to her capacity to trust people can be at least partially repaired. The intimacy required to help her with her addiction and with her history is handled with more care than these kinds of storylines usually receive in games, and the result is a companion whose story is earned. The pattern across the companions is consistent. The Wasteland has taken things from all of them, and each one has found some way of remaining operational, despite those losses, and what their stories explore is the cost of the strategies they've chosen and the possibilities that the strategies have closed off. The companions are, in a structural sense, case studies in how people manage catastrophic loss and the diversity of their strategies. From Boone's controlled absence to Nick Valentine's deliberate investment in unsolvable cases to Kate's controlled aggression to Veronica's ironic self-awareness, represents something close to a taxonomy of post-traumatic functioning. What the companion narratives collectively suggest is something the main narratives don't always make explicit, that in the Wasteland, survival is not the hardest part. The hardest part is figuring out what survival is for, finding something worth continuing for, locating a purpose or a connection or a project that makes the ongoing difficulty of existing in this world feel, on balance, worth the cost. The companions who have that are the ones who seem most alive. The companions who haven't found it yet are the ones whose stories are about the search. Part 25. The weight of 200 years' time itself as a horror. There is a specific kind of horror in the Fallout universe that doesn't get named as often as the Vault experiments or the Eldritch entities, but that suffuses almost every part of the world the games take place in. It's the horror of duration, of the sheer length of time that has elapsed between the moment the world ended and the moment the player character is moving through its ruins. 200 years. 200 years is longer than the United States existed as a nation before the Great War. It's longer than the distance in time between the Napoleonic Wars and now. It is, by any ordinary historical measure, an enormous gulf enough time for languages to change substantially, for entire political and social frameworks to develop and collapse, for living memory of a world to transmit through so many generational layers that it becomes more legend than history. In the Fallout world, 200 years has produced ghouls who remember the pre-war period firsthand, who watched the bombs fall from wherever they were standing, who have been in the ruins for the entire interval, watching everything around them change, buildings collapse further, communities form and fall. The population of the Wasteland shift and reconfigure while their own bodies remain arrested in the forms they took at the moment of ghoulification. Harold, the recurring character who first appears in the original Fallout 1, was there from the beginning. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 was a person with a job and an address and a car before he was what he became. Raul Tejada in New Vegas remembers the day the bombs fell from a hilltop in Mexico, remembers watching the detonations on the horizon, remembers what it was like to know that the world he'd grown up in was ending in real time. These characters carry the full weight of 200 years in a way that no amount of historical documentation can quite match. They were there. They knew the world the bombs ended. And they've been in the wasteland for the entire interval since, accumulating a kind of experiential knowledge that has no parallel in the world as it existed before the war. They've watched political movements rise and fall. They've seen communities destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. They've outlived potentially everyone who ever meant something to them, and then outlived the next generation and the generation after that. What this does to a person, what it would do to anyone, what it has done to the ghouls who are still functional and haven't gone feral, is something the games gesture at without fully exploring. How do you form attachments when your attachment history is long enough to hold entire generations who are now dead? How do you maintain a sense of self across a duration that would transform any ordinary person beyond recognition through ordinary experience, while being held in a physical form that doesn't age, that remains visually the same person from the outside, while the inside has been reshaped by 2 centuries of loss? How do you continue to care about the outcome of events when you've seen enough outcomes to know that the pattern tends to repeat regardless of who wins? The answers the characters who have survived this long tend to give, when players probe them, are various. Raoul copes with a specific kind of exhausted humor, a stance of detached irony toward the world that provides emotional distance without complete disconnection. Harold eventually becomes something so continuous with the landscape around him that the boundary between his grief and the world's grief dissolves. Nick Valentine channels it into the work, into the specific, manageable, finite cases that provide structure and purpose without requiring him to hold the full scope of what he's been through at once. But the underlying reality that these characters have lived long enough to know things no one who wasn't there can know, and to have lost things that have no equivalent in the shorter lifespans of the people around them, is always present. Raoul's sister, the family Harold mentions. The relationships and the places and the ordinary textures of the world that the bombs took, 200 years of distance doesn't resolve that loss. It just puts more time between you and it while the loss remains as present as it was on the first day. The wasteland is, in this sense, a world full of people who are grieving on timescales that the ordinary frameworks for grief weren't designed to handle. And the question of how you grieve something that ended 200 years ago, that you personally witnessed, that you've been living in the aftermath of for the entire interval. That question is one the Fallout universe never quite answers, because it doesn't have an answer. It just has people who are still in it, still moving forward, still finding their various ways of continuing to exist in a world shaped by a loss they were personally present for. That's the deepest form of loneliness the wasteland produces, not the absence of other people, but the presence of so many other people, none of whom have been here long enough to share the specific weight of what it means to have survived this long, to have been awake for this much of the history. The ghouls who carry 200 years are not more alone because no one is around them. They're more alone because no one who is around them can fully understand what they're carrying, and because the understanding that would help has died with every person who also carried it. Part 26. The silence after what the wasteland sounds like when nothing is happening. This is perhaps the strangest part of any Fallout game, and the one that's hardest to talk about using the language of lore and theory. It's the silence. Not the silence of exploration, which has its own ambient sounds, the wind, the distant sound of monstrous movement, the creak of ruined structures, but the silence in the moments after a major discovery, after a revelation, after following a thread of lore to its end and sitting with what you've found. The Fallout games are designed in their layout, in their pacing, in the rhythm of their world to produce these moments. You find the Vault 11 terminal that describes the annual sacrifice elections. You listen to the last audio log in the sequence, and then there's a pause. A moment before you move to the next thing, where you're just in the ruins of a place where something terrible happened, and the ruins are still and the information you've just received is settling in. These moments are intentional. The games put interesting lore in locations that require effort to reach, that require navigating through enemies and environmental hazards, that require you to spend time in a space before you encounter the most important thing it contains. The effort is part of it. The journey through the deteriorating rooms before you find the terminal, the corpses you pass before you understand what killed them, the details that accumulate into a picture before the picture is complete, all of this is designed to put you in a particular state when the revelation arrives. A state of having spent time in the place, having a physical relationship with it, being prepared for something heavy, and when the heavy thing arrives, the game doesn't underline it. It doesn't play a dramatic stinger or change the lighting or have a character explain what it means. It gives you the information and lets the silence around it hold whatever weight you bring to it. The sound design of the Fallout games, the distant wind, the occasional creak, the specific quality of quiet in an underground space is calibrated to maintain a texture of atmosphere that doesn't interrupt the experience of sitting with something disturbing. The music pulls back at exactly the right moments. The ambient sound becomes more present in your attention when the content is most dense. This is why people listen to Fallout content to fall asleep. Not because it's not disturbing, it clearly is, but because the pacing of the disturbance matches the pacing of a mind that's slowing down. Information arrives, settles, creates a response. The response doesn't need to resolve immediately. Another piece of information arrives and settles and creates another response that also doesn't need to resolve. The narrative doesn't push toward a conclusion. It creates a space where thinking and feeling can move slowly and thoroughly through something without urgency. The wasteland at rest is a specific kind of space. Not peaceful, exactly. Not safe. But stable in its ruin, holding still for the examination, patient in the way that things that have already been destroyed can afford to be patient. It's been 200 years. The vaults have waited this long for someone to find their records. The obelisk in the Dunwich building has been pressed against from the inside for long enough that a few more hours don't matter. The holotapes in the abandoned shelter have been waiting for an audience since the day they were recorded. When you find them, when you listen, when the voice speaks into the present from whatever moment it was recorded, the wasteland is quiet around you. Whatever you discover, whatever disturbing thing the lore reveals, the quiet remains, the ruins hold still. And in that stillness, there's something that might almost, from the right angle, in the right frame of mind, feel like peace. Not because the things you've learned are peaceful, they're not, but because the act of knowing them, of bearing witness to what the wasteland contains, of being the audience that all those holotapes and terminal entries and audio logs were made for, without certainty of finding that act is its own kind of completion. The record was kept. You received it. The person who kept it found their listener across whatever distance of time and devastation. And the wasteland, for a moment, is quiet around the completion of that exchange. That's what this has been. A night in the ruins, moving carefully through what the Fallout universe has left in the dark for people willing to go looking. The vault experiments, and the eldritch horror, and the question of consciousness, and the shadow of the enclave, and the man in the pod, and the cult that worships radiation, and the casino that doesn't let you leave, and the courier who survived too much, and the war that might have been a choice, and the questions that won't be answered. You went looking. You found things. The wasteland was patient with you while you did. Now sleep. The ruins will be here. They've learned to wait. Part 27. The Dead Cities Megaton, Rivet City, and what rebuilding costs. When players in Fallout 3 first step out of Vault 101 and see the capital wasteland spread out before them, the gray-brown hills, the collapsed highway bridges, the distant silhouettes of ruined skyscrapers, what they're seeing is not emptiness. It's the beginning of a recovery. A slow, difficult, partially unconscious recovery that has been happening for 2 centuries without central coordination or visible plan, because the people who survived in the ruins had nowhere else to go, and so they stayed, and staying eventually produced places to stay in. Megaton is a settlement built around a nuclear bomb. This is often presented as either a joke or a symbol of post-apocalyptic insanity, but there's something more specific going on. The founders of Megaton settled where they settled because the bomb's crater provided a natural depression that could be walled off. The walls that ring Megaton, built from pieces of aircraft fuselage and corrugated metal and whatever else was available, represent years of effort and engineering and community labor. People stood watch while other people welded. People organized material acquisition while other people planned the layout. A town grew up through accumulated small decisions by people who probably weren't thinking about founding a town at all, but who needed shelter and found that building together was more effective than building alone. The bomb in the center of Megaton is tolerated, rather than simply diffused, partly because disarming it is technically difficult. It fell on the Great War and failed to detonate, but the warhead is still active, and partly, perhaps, because having a nuclear weapon at the center of your settlement is its own kind of deterrent. Nobody is going to attack Megaton with the intention of leveling the place. The strategic logic of the town's founders, intentional or accidental, worked. Rivet City is more ambitious. An aircraft carrier grounded in the Potomac, converted over decades into a functioning settlement with its own economy, its own class system, its own internal political tensions, its own bar, and its own market, and its own security force. The people who live in Rivet City have a quality of life that most of the Capital Wasteland's population doesn't approach. They have something that functions like stability. They've built it inside the hull of a pre-war military vessel, using pre-war engineering as their foundation, and the result is one of the most complete settlements in any Fallout game. But even Rivet City has its divisions. The bridge that connects to the city's main body is maintained by a family, and there's ongoing conflict about who gets access to the best parts of the ship. There's an internal debate about whether the city should expand or remain contained, about what obligations the relatively prosperous owe to the people outside their walls. The process of rebuilding, even when it works, reproduces the same social tensions that characterize the pre-war world. The question of who gets what and who decides isn't solved by Apocalypse. It resumes, in modified form, as soon as communities become stable enough to have things worth distributing. What the Capital Wasteland settlements collectively demonstrate is that humans rebuild whether or not the conditions are favorable. Given time and rudimentary safety, humans form communities. Communities develop internal structures. Internal structures develop inequalities. Inequalities develop tensions. The pattern is remarkably consistent across every settlement in every Fallout game, and the consistency is itself a piece of information about what human social behavior defaults to when the extraordinary circumstances of catastrophe begin to stabilize into the ordinary circumstances of daily life. The extraordinary circumstances don't disappear. People in Megaton are still living next to a nuclear bomb. People in Rivet City are still negotiating the difference between the people who got the upper cabins and the people who didn't. The wasteland context is always present, always shaping what's possible. But inside that context, the human tendencies that produce the pre-war world are visible again. Cooperation and competition and hierarchy and community and all the rest, not because the war taught people nothing, but because these tendencies are deep enough that they reassert themselves even in conditions designed to prevent them. What settlements like Megaton and Rivet City demonstrate, finally, is that the question of what comes after the apocalypse isn't primarily a question about what the apocalypse did to people. It's a question about what people do with what they have available. The same tendencies that built the pre-war world are the tendencies building whatever comes next. Whether those tendencies get aimed better the second time depends on choices that the settlement's residents are making right now about what kind of community they want to be, about who they're willing to help, about what they're willing to share, and what they're willing to protect. The Wasteland is a workshop for that question. Imperfect, underfunded, frequently dangerous, occasionally brilliant. The cities in the ruins are early attempts at answers. Whether the answers improve over time is the open question that Fallout keeps asking, and that the Wasteland keeps not fully answering, because the answering is still in progress. A final note on sitting with the Wasteland. There is something that happens when you spend enough time in a fictional world as carefully constructed as Fallout's. The categories that usually separate fiction from reality, the obvious reminder that none of this is real, that these vaults didn't exist, that no bombs fell on October 23rd, 2077 start to feel less important than the questions the fiction is raising. Because the questions are real even when the world containing them isn't. The tendency of institutions to drift from their founding purpose is real. The way that good intentions calcify into self-serving policy is real. The cruelty that becomes possible when human beings are treated as research material rather than as people is real. The specific quality of loneliness that comes from outliving the context that once gave your life its meaning, that's real too, recognizable to anyone who has experienced enough loss. Fallout earns the weight it carries because it's paying attention to real things. The monsters and the ruins and the vaults and the terrible experiments are the skin of something that is, underneath, a sustained meditation on human nature, on institutional failure, on the cost of treating people as instruments, on the possibility and the difficulty of doing better. That's why the Wasteland stays with you. Not because it scared you, though it might have, but because it kept asking questions that you couldn't dismiss as only belonging to a fictional world, because the fictional world kept revealing itself as a transparent lens over the actual one. You've spent a night in the wasteland. The questions it carries are yours now for whatever that's worth, for wherever they take you. The ruins were patient with your investigation. The holotapes were waiting for exactly this kind of listener. And somewhere in the dark, the mysterious stranger knows you've been paying attention. Sleep well.